Hey kids, this is the final chapter of C.L.R. James' Political Biography by Kent Worcester. It's chapter 7 of 7, and it's titled At the Rendezvous. The image and memories of C.L.R. James held by most people who knew him or saw him speak date from the publication of Beyond a Boundary or later. From this point on, James was a de facto living historical figure with an accumulated record and reputation that gave James an entry into certain discussions, but that was also something of an incomplete caricature. Linked to the great causes of the receding past, James carried with him the burden of self-presentation in this period as never before. It was in the 1960s and 1970s that James struggled to find a way of transmitting his ideas and writings to a new kind of audience. This task was both assisted and complicated by his historical presence and historical self-consciousness. James' exciting personal story exuded a special kind of revolutionist glamour that made it more and more difficult to locate the complex individual personality housed inside the impressive historical trajectory. This question of the tension between James's heart and his historical reputation lies at the center of V.S. Naipaul's painful dissection of the C.L.R. James story. In his recent quasi-autobiographical book, Away in the World, Naipaul presents us with a character named Lebrun, quote, the Trinidadian Panamanian communist of the 1930s, end quote, who later assumed the role as, quote, the black spokesman of our country, end quote. V.S. Naipaul, Away in the World, published 1994. According to Wikipedia, Away in the World is a 1994 book by Nobel laureate V.S. Naipaul. Although it was marketed as a novel in America, Away in the World, which consists of linked narratives, is arguably something different. Despite Naipaul's achievements as a novelist, in later life Naipaul has described the novel as an outmoded form. Away in the World was published in the UK with the subtitle Sequence, and this is reflected in British reviews. In the USA, it was published as a novel, apparently at the request of the American publisher. Away in the World is more fictional than Naipaul's earlier historical work, The Loss of El Dorado of 1969, which deals with some of the same material, for example, with the lives of Sir Walter Raleigh and Francisco de Miranda. Naipaul also includes autobiographical material, partly fictionalized, which was not in the earlier book. Back to the text and footnote. Although Lebrun bears a certain resemblance to C.L.R. James, they are not the same person. Unlike Lebrun, James did not work with the oil worker leader Uriah Butler. He did not have family ties to Panama, and he never spoke at the University of Woodford Square. Yet the similarities are too striking to be overlooked. Lebrun is a renowned leftist and Pan-Africanist who built a small radical organization in the United States during a long period of exile. Some of the character's features may have been intended as a slam at James's politics. Lebrun foments political mischief in West Africa, for example, and his book, The Second Struggle, Speeches and Writings 1962-72, is printed in East Germany by a writer and Queen's Royal College graduate who initially valued James's support, but who decisively broke with all forms of leftist politics during the 1960s. In some respects, Naipaul's characterizations are keenly observant. His depiction of a dinner party in London, for example, where C.L.R. and Selma entertain a young, unnamed Indo-Caribbean writer is classic. Quote, it was all immensely intelligent and gripping. He talked about music and the influence on composers of the instruments of their time. He talked about military matters. I had met no one like that from our region, no one who had given so much time to reading and thought, no one who had organized so much information in this appetizing way, ... It was rhetoric, of course. And, of course, it was loaded in his favor. He couldn't be interrupted. Like royalty, he raised all the topics, and he would have been a master of the topics he raised. End quote. Naipaul. away in the world. In Napal's story, the young writer becomes partially seduced by Lebrun and his circle to the point where, quote, I couldn't help noticing that I was being regarded as part of Lebrun's revolution, end quote. For a brief moment, he finds this thought rather appealing, quote, I could sense that I was being invited to shed my racial or cultural burdens and to be part of their brotherhood, ... It would have been marvelous. It would have been less trouble if I could have pretended to be a convert, end quote. Napal away in the world. But the young writer ultimately resists losing his Indian identity and takes objection to the, quote, communist terminology of Lebrun's, quote, hack work. But he ultimately resists losing his Indian identity and takes objection to the, quote, communist terminology of Lebrun's, quote, hack work, essays dating back to the anti-colonial movement. Quote, did he believe in those articles, end quote? He asks quizzically, quote, or were they written by a man who knew that such articles only filled space in official magazines, end quote. Napal, away in the world. Napal's portrait is both recognizable and troubling because of its didactic conflation of James's radicalism and Soviet propaganda. While Napal evinces some sympathy for the man, Napal has no time for the man's politics. He dismisses his fictionalized character as, quote, an impresario of revolution, end quote, and contrasts the, quote, complicated ideas of Lebrun and the simple politics he encouraged, end quote. Napal, away in the world. With great sensitivity, he admits his failure to come to terms with Lebrun's dense subjectivity, asking, quote, how could one enter the emotions of a black man as old as the century, end quote. But he quickly turns around and jabs Lebrun for pandering to sycophants and for the, quote, hysteria of his speech. Where Napal really veers off is in his notion that the hardships of the past distorted Lebrun's personality. In an unconvincing concluding passage, Napal writes, quote, they had no means of understanding or assessing a man who had been born early in the century into a very hard world, whose intellectual growth had at every stage been accompanied by a growing rawness of sensibility, and whose political resolutions, expressing the wish not to go mad, had been in the nature of spiritual struggles occurring in the depth of his being, end quote. Author's emphasis, Worcester's emphasis. That's from Napal, Away in the World. What Napal describes as raw sensibility, James knew as a cool maturity that expressed itself primarily through irony and measured historical observation. James simply wasn't as torn up inside as Napal's account would suggest. Furthermore, to the degree that Lebrun is intended to represent James, the idea that he actively repressed an underlying madness is completely at odds with all other portrayals of a proud and dignified rhetorician. A close approximation of the truth would be to say that James, quote, in the depth of his being, end quote, had a pacific temperament, coated by a pride in achievement and aptitude. Pace Napal, James was never a Stalinist hack, nor was James in, quote, anguish. James did not, quote, become a child again, looking only for peace, end quote, in his old age. Instead, James remained a sane old man, waiting to be liberated from a sick body, committed to basic socialist principles. New section. A very different version of these years was offered by George Rawik, a young historian who had been active in the Socialist Party. George Rawik traveled to England in 1963 and stayed with CLR and Selma James for several months in their home in North London. Rawik later described their household as cluttered with books and papers, its occupants strapped for cash, but nevertheless busily receiving visitors from all corners of the globe. Rawik also recalled the strong impression that conversations with James left on him. Quote, we spent a lot of time talking about politics, history, literature, and art. Living with him was like an apprenticeship. Writing history, which I had been doing, is nice, but it isn't revolutionary politics. I learned by watching James speak, listening to James speak. I lecture like James, never using notes." End quote. Footnote: Author's interview with George Rawlik, December 28, 1980. Rawlik, who had known Martin Glaberman in Detroit, had been won over to the socialism from below perspective of the Facing Reality group by the late 1950s and was impressed by the purity of its state capitalist analysis of the Soviet Union. One point Rawlik remembers in particular was James's habit of purchasing multiple copies of books, magazines, and picture postcards to pass on to friends and acquaintances. Quote, "James was always broke," end quote. Rawlik said, quote, "because he was always giving away books and never getting them back. He wanted people to read," end quote. Footnote: Author's interview with George Rawlik, December 28, 1980. Another visitor to the Scottish historian James Young met CLR James in 1956 and described him as a, quote, "modest, open-minded, innovative socialist thinker," end quote. See James D. Young, Making Trouble, Autobiographical Explorations in Socialism, published 1987. I'm not seeing any good descriptions for this book. Back to the text and footnote. Of course, going as far back as the early 1920s, James had exchanged books, manuscripts, and ideas with acquaintances and friends. Footnote: In Beyond a Boundary, James reports that as a young man, he subscribed, quote, not only to the Cricketer, but the Literary Times Supplement, the Times Educational Supplement, the Observer, the Sunday Times, the Criterion, the London Mercury, the Musical Review, the Gramophone, the Nouvelle Revue Française, and Mercure de France. For some time, The Nation and the New Republic, the editions of the Evening Standard when Arnold Bennett wrote in it, and the Daily Telegraph with Rebecca West. I read them, filed most of them. I read and even bought many of the books they discussed. I had a circle of friends, most of them white, with whom I exchanged ideas, books, records, and manuscripts, end quote. James, Beyond a Boundary. End footnote. As Rawlik's anecdote suggests, James had a generous nature, as well as perhaps a careless attitude toward money. As he entered old age, his personal style mellowed even as his politics remained firm. He combined a number of different and in certain respects contradictory elements: a cool revolutionary ardor, a seriousness about ideas, a wry sense of humor, a friendly disposition, and a deeply internalized code of honor. Although these elements had been present from the very beginning, the particular way they were combined and integrated was distinctive to this period of James's life. Anyone who had known James as a 1940s Johnsonite and then talked to him in London in the 1960s would have appreciated his evolution, how he had shed the aroma of revolutionary conspiracy and adopted a dignified, older, gentlemanly persona in its stead. Yet he retained the crisp reserve that had always made him stand out in the Trotskyist milieu. George Rawlik returned to London in 1967 for more collaborations, joining James Glaberman and another former Johnsonite, William Gorman, to work on a sequel to Facing Reality entitled The Gathering Forces. See if there's anything for this. I don't see any description of this, but it is available at Marxist.org. Back to the text. Marking the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, the document was intended as a response to the new political realities of the mid-1960s. It was the most sustained attempt that CLR and his associates made to reach out to black and, quote, new left movements in the age of Aquarius. Sorry, there's no quote there. I fucked that up. CLR and his associates made to reach out to black and new left movements in the age of Aquarius. They clearly hoped that the Johnsonite perspective could win converts among the young and the newly radicalized, yet the impact of their views was felt more on the undergrowth of the new left rather than on its public manifestations. Part of the explanation for this had to do with their ingrained worker centrism, and also because James' polemics were framed in terms that rendered him inaccessible to a non-socialist audience. CLR's avowed sympathy for aspects of American history and culture may also have puzzled some activists. That's actually very interesting. I don't know if the anti-Americanism became such a component of like the global left until this period. Yet connections were made. By the late 1960s, James was well received on many college campuses, and James prodded a number of individuals in an independent Marxist direction. Footnote. It was also in this period that James' A History of Negro Revolt was reprinted by former activists in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee under the title of A History of Pan-African Revolt, and that the Black Jacobins, having been republished by Vintage in 1963, circulated widely on campuses. End footnote. The New Left was only one of several disparate audiences that James and his old comrades sought to address in the heady 1960s and enigmatic 1970s. Another potential constituency was generated by the late 60s revival of Pan-Africanism across the African diaspora. The Black Studies movement in the United States, the Black Power marches in the West Indies, and the attempt to concoct an authentic, quote, African socialism were all signs that a, quote, third wave, Garveyism and IASB standing for the first two waves, Pan-Africanism had finally arrived. While close observers may have judged particular expressions of this third wave to be hopelessly compromised by one or more individual personalities, the underlying welcome pulse of a re-emergent Afrocentrism was unmistakable. Few individuals were in a better position to both comprehend and speak to the internationalist dynamic of this resurgent Pan-Africanism than CLR James. But somehow the transition from celebrated representative of an earlier generation to tactician for today's movement never quite arrived. In addition to Pan-Africanism, the world of literature and criticism was one that James responded to. With the publication of Beyond a Boundary, James was in a position to reinvent himself as a person of letters in the Anglophone world. Despite all of the caveats and disclaimers, there was no denying the powerful appeal of English literary life and manners. James's nickname for the Times Literary Supplement, Old Solemnity, betrayed a deep affection for a publication that had a formative influence on his whole outlook. Footnote, James Behind a Boundary, page 150. Besides, James had always felt that he was as good a writer as any that the London scene had to offer, and by contributing occasional pieces to such quintessentially English publications as The New Society, Encounter, and The Cricketer, James played a part-time role in the literary agenda setting of the metropolitan intelligentsia. Although his public reputation never quite gelled, except perhaps in the West Indies, he seemed unperturbed by his relative anonymity in the United States, which he was able to visit from 1967 onwards, once he had been granted permission to return by the appropriate authorities. As had always been the case, the influence he enjoyed was mainly through personal contacts and chance encounters that scattered readers and listeners had with his books, essays, and speeches. Everywhere the story was the same. Some people knew his work intimately and had been forever challenged by it, but most of those who could have benefited the most never had the opportunity to hear of the man or of his ideas. New section. Largely completed before the author's return to Trinidad in 1958, Beyond a Boundary remains a classic of Caribbean literature. Two small extracts published in the late 1950s neatly illustrated the major themes that the book so artfully combined: West Indian autobiography and the organic connection between cricket and artistic and social practices. In Dr. W. G. Grace and English History, published in The Nation, Trinidad, James describes the elegant batting style and personal accomplishments of the Victorian cricket batsman W. G. Grace. Wikipedia says William Gilbert Grace lived from 1848 to 1915. W. G. Grace was an English amateur cricketer who was important in the development of the sport and is widely considered one of its greatest players. W. G. Grace was nominally amateur as a cricketer, but he is said to have made more money from his cricketing activities than any professional cricketer. W. G. Grace was an extremely competitive player, and although he was one of the most famous men in England, he was also one of the most controversial on account of his gamesmanship and money-making. W. G. Grace played first-class cricket for a record equaling 44 seasons from 1865 to 1908, during which W. G. Grace captained England, Gloucestershire, I don't know if I'm saying that right, the Gentlemen Marylebone Cricket Club, the United South of England 11, and several other teams. Right-handed as both batsman and bowler, W. G. Grace dominated the sport during his career. W. G. Grace's technical innovation and enormous influence left a lasting legacy. An outstanding all-rounder, W. G. Grace excelled at all the essential skills of batting, bowling, and fielding, but it is for his batting that he is most renowned. He is held to have invented modern batsmanship. Usually opening the innings, he was particularly admired for his mastery of all strokes, and his level of expertise was said by contemporary reviewers to be unique. He generally captained the teams he played for at all levels because of his skill and tactical acumen. Grace came from a cricketing family. E.M. Grace was one of the elder brothers and Fred Grace his younger brother. In 1880, they were members of the same England team, the first team three brothers played together in Test cricket. Grace took part in other sports also. He was a champion 440-yard hurdler as a young man and played football for the Wanderers. In later life, he developed enthusiasm for golf, lawn bowls, and curling. W. G. Grace qualified as a medical practitioner in 1879. This guy looks cool as fuck. If you ever get see a picture of W. G. Grace. He's got a huge beard, looks metal as fuck. Back to the text. The article argues for the centrality of major sporting figures such as Grace in the cultural development of the West Indies. James acknowledged the degree to which Grace's career inspired and instructed him in the ways of the English gentleman. In the article, Nationalist Strain, which appeared in the New Statesman, another formative influence, James's maternal grandfather, Josh Rutter, the first black engine driver on the Trinidad Government Railway, was woven into the Jamesian tableau. Josh Rutter was a, quote, great favorite with everyone, end quote, particularly his grandson. Responsible for the run between San Fernando and the hamlet of Princestown, where Josh Rutter lived, Josh Rutter's story is used to embody the triumph of the individual personality. The trainman had one special day of glory, quote, one Sunday afternoon near the end of the century, end quote. Josh Rutter was asked by the manager of a nearby sugar estate to look at a broken-down engine which was causing delays in shipping. All the foremen had tried to restart the engine with no success, quote. Now on the way to the factory, Josh may have dug up from his tenacious memory some half-forgotten incident of an engine which would not go, or he may have come to the conclusion that if all of these highly trained and practiced engineers were unable to discover what was wrong, the probability was that they were overlooking some very simple matter that was under their very noses. End quote. When Rutter arrived at the estate, he insisted on working on the engine alone. The manager agreed, albeit with reservations, quote, no one will ever know exactly what Josh did in there, end quote. But the engine quickly sputtered to life. The key aspect of the story is that Rutter refused to tell anyone how the job was done, quote, the obstinate man wouldn't even tell me, end quote, James later remembered. But as his grandson was preparing to leave for Nelson, England in 1932, the 80-year-old grandfather explained himself, quote, they were white men with all their MICE and RICE, bracket, engineering certificates, end quote, and bracket, and all their degrees, and it was their business to fix it. I had to fix it for them. Why should I tell them? End quote. Returning to what I have termed his, quote, anthropological, intellectual roots, James found a way to weave his family story into an allegorical reading of West Indian history. While the book's themes, the author's childhood, cricket, art, and politics are complexly interconnected, each may be viewed in its own terms. Beyond a Boundary opens on a autobiographical note, with a, quote, small boy of 6, end quote, discovering that by, quote, standing on a chair, end quote, he, quote, could watch practice every afternoon and matches on Saturday, end quote. The book introduces us to such memorable characters as the truant Matthew Bondman and the author's own family, led by a strong-willed mother and stern father. As we have seen, the family lived in a close-knit social environment that James left behind in the 1920s and 1930s. In different ways, cricket and literature represented two paths pointing beyond Tunapuna and North Trace, and yet they reinforced the sense of discipline, fair play, and the reward of effort that was drilled into his brain at home and at school. Their power for good is lovingly described in the book. Literature represents enlightenment. Cricket exemplifies the dialectic of individual freedom and collective organization. The autobiographical sections of Beyond a Boundary persuasively attribute a powerful sense of enchantment to the Trinidad of the not-so-distant past. This aspect of the book appealed to several generations of readers who might have been expected to be unimpressed by the author's revolutionary ideology. In addition, the book advances a provocative argument about cricket's central role in shaping Anglophone Caribbean culture and identity. As Neil Lazarus rightly notes, James, quote, identified cricket as a privileged site for the playing out an imaginary resolution of social antagonisms in the colonial and post-colonial West Indies, end quote. Neil Lazarus, Cricket and National Culture in the writings of C.L.R. James, featured in Paget Henry and Paul Bull's edited volume, C.L.R. James's Caribbean. Back to the text. End footnote. The most provocative aspect of Beyond a Boundary, however, concerns the argument that cricket is effectively an art form. The author defends cricket not merely as an instrument of identity formation, but as an expression of the artistic impulse. In a chapter entitled, What is Art?, James claims that cricket is unique in offering a ritualized performance piece that connotes complex human relations rather than mere competitive entertainment. Cricket's elaborate rules and patterns of play, in James's view, address deep aesthetic longings that arise out of our collective need to give a coherent shape to the social world. The game, James argues, quote, is so organized that at all times it is compelled to reproduce the central action which characterizes all good drama from the days of the Greeks to our own. Two individuals are pitted against each other in a conflict that is strictly personal, but no less strictly representative of a social group. One individual batsman faces one individual bowler, but each represents his side, end quote. James, Beyond a Boundary. In cricket, quote, was that quote or dirt? Oh, that's dirt. In cricket, the audience's attention is divided between the batter and the bowler, two dramatic figures harmonically joined in a circle of sport. The conflict between the two is constant, and at the same time it is dynamic, in motion, and ever-changing. For James, cricket is a kind of dramatic art because the repetition appeals to the human need for, quote, collective sensations. These sensations are, quote, the stuff of human life. It is of this stuff that the drama of cricket is composed, end quote. James, Beyond a Boundary. The individual cricketer displays all of the, quote, immense variety of physical motion and, quote, suggestion and figurative oil portraits and ballet. Quote, the batsman can shape to hit practically around the points of the compass, end quote. James, Beyond a Boundary. The chapter records the different strokes that a batter can choose at all angles. Cricket thus differs from other organized sports in the way that it combines the artistry of pure motion with the theater of the batter versus the bowler. Despite its low social and historiographical status, cricket allows the audience to perform a special kind of role, as it is the audience, James insists, that ultimately decides what constitutes good cricket on and off the playing field. The very ambition of James's discussion is impressive, and the historical and anthropological analysis of the impact of cricket on West Indian identity, which I have only alluded to here, is highly plausible. Footnote: James remained interested in the history of cricket. See C.L.R. James Cricket, edited by Anna Grimshaw, published in 1986, end footnote. Furthermore, one cannot help but be moved by the democratic thrust of the central argument that humble and unlettered individuals can produce their own masterpieces in collaboration with the mass audience. Yet while it is important to recognize the aesthetic dimensions of athletics, there may be obstacles in categorizing cricket as another subject of the humanities. Unlike drama, music, or literature, cricket as a specific practice has limited potential as a reproducible object. As engaging as the evolving patterns of play may be, they are unlikely to sustain our interest if the performance is repeated, say with the aid of a video recorder. In addition, the distinction between cricket and other sports is perhaps not as firm as James's analysis would suggest. International cricket takes place in a determinedly capitalistic environment, and even at the local level it is played as a competitive sport with losers, winners, and scorekeepers. Footnote: see Kenneth Surin, C.L.R. James's Materialist Aesthetic of Cricket, published in Alistair Hennessy's Intellectuals and the 20th-Century Caribbean, Volume 1, Spectre of the New Class, the Commonwealth Caribbean. It's published in 1992. End footnote. Like other sports, cricket contains artistic aspects, and it may generate or satisfy a specific artistic aspirations. However, and at the risk of confirming E.P. Thompson's wry observation that, quote, American theorists will not understand this, but the clue to everything lies in his proper appreciation of the game of cricket, end quote. It seems to me that as a material social practice, cricket is only problematically described as the epitome of high art. Footnote. The quote from Thompson is on the back cover of Paul Bull's edited volume, C.L.R. James's Life and Work. Next footnote. For a more sympathetic analysis, see Sylvia Winter's In Quest of Matthew Bondsman in Bull's edited volume, C.L.R. James's Life and Work. Winter argues James's book offers a spirited attack on, quote, bourgeois mythology in its aesthetic form and deconstructs a central aspect of the ruling social imaginaire. He is taking them, bracket the fine arts, end bracket, out of the box in which bourgeois critical canons, responding to a socio-ideological code rather than to a purely critical conceptual imperative, have confined them, end quote. End footnote. Having lifted cricket above the realm of entertainment, James uses his particular conception of sports to address the question, what do men live by? The answer is clear, not by politics alone. Taking issue with Trotsky's bald assertion that, quote, workers are deflected from politics by sports, end quote, James writes that, quote, with my past I simply could not accept that, end quote. James, Beyond a Boundary. It was no accident, James argues, that 19th century movements for universal male suffrage and a new popular passion for organized games emerged at the same historical moment. Quote, this same public that wanted sports and games so eagerly wanted popular democracy too, ... end quote. James goes on to find significance in the fact that, quote, over the second half of the 19th century, sparking the great international movement, bracket, for the democratic franchise, end bracket, drawing all eyes to it, startling millions who otherwise would have taken no notice, creating the myth and legend, there began to loom the gigantic black-bearded figure of W.G. Grace, end quote. James, Beyond a Boundary. The conjunction of democratic movements and popular enthusiasm for games in the 19th century paralleled the union of the Olympic Games and participatory democracy in ancient Greece. Quote, they who laid the intellectual foundations of the Western world, end quote, James says, quote, were the most fanatical players and organizers of games that the world has ever known, end quote. James, Beyond a Boundary. By comparison, Trotsky's position looks somewhat unimaginative and philistine. Quote, men live by that which truly animates them, and sports play a positive role in the mobilizing, inspiring, and instructing the masses, despite Trotsky's dismissive stance. Beyond a Boundary returns again and again to cricket's potential as a social, cultural, and historical force, posing the question, quote, what do they know of cricket who only cricket know, end quote. The book's original title, Beyond a Boundary, also offers a dense mixture of technical information concerning various aspects of the game. Here the author recounts the performance of his old friend, Leary Constantine, on the pitch in 1928. Quote, Hammond bowled a ball pitching a foot or so outside of the off stump, breaking in. Constantine advanced his foot halfway to meet the ball and saw the break crowd in on him. Doubling himself almost into two, to give himself space, he cut the ball a little to the left of point for a four, which no one in the world, not even himself, could have stopped, end quote. James. Beyond a Boundary. A succession of passages movingly describe incidents that occurred on some long-forgotten pitch. The effect is so charming that the book, in the words of one English newspaper columnist, made cricket, quote, safe for the left, end quote. Footnote, Martin Walker, Diary, Manchester Guardian, August 31st, 1982, end footnote. In providing so much rich detail and by investing it with such great affection, the book effectively does for cricket what Melville's Moby Dick did for whaling. Both books swamp the reader with thickets of seemingly extraneous material, and yet somehow manage to transcend the realm of mere description. Upon publication, V.S. Naipaul said that the book, quote, gives base and solidity to West Indian literary endeavor, end quote. V.S. Naipaul, Sporting Life, published in Encounter 21, number 3, September 1963, end footnote. Even the British communist newspaper, The Daily Worker, gave the ex-Trotskyist a friendly notice. Yet American publishers shied away from the book for some 2 decades, perhaps fearing it would attract the sort of backhanded compliment that was paid by a reviewer in the Boston Globe in the mid-1980s. Quote, unless you are in some way a part of the diseased empire or admirer thereof, you probably wouldn't care to read it. You would be missing something rare and strange, end quote. Footnote, Margaret Manning, Cricket was all that mattered. Published in Boston Globe, June 3, 1984. She was reviewing the 1984 Pantheon Books edition, end footnote. Rare and strange as it may have been, Beyond a Boundary took several years to become a classic. After an initial burst of favorable reviews, James's life settled back into the old routines. On the surface, a parallel may be drawn between James's activities in London during the 1930s and during the 1960s. Both decades were marked by rising social unrest and left-wing political mobilization. International issues, Vietnam, Spain, played an important role in demarcating political boundaries in the 1960s as well as the 1930s. More specifically, James struck Marxist and Pan-African chords in both periods, promising to import a kind of Marxian strategic acuity into Pan-Africanism and a more or less Pan-African grasp of the social integration of the world system into Marxism. In both decades, moreover, the possibility of identifying and stimulating a revolutionary breakthrough was uppermost in his mind. An important difference, however, between his efforts in the 1930s and in the 1960s was that he had less success arriving at the sort of intellectual and political synthesis in the latter period that had been achieved in the Black Jacobins. Nothing that he wrote in the 1960s came close to bringing together the two political movements in such a provocative and intellectually satisfying form. Indeed, only a certain percentage of what he wrote in the aftermath of his return from Trinidad exhibited the same sort of flair or acumen as his best work from the 1930s. For reasons having to do with changes both in the society and in himself, he was unable to forge the same sort of nourishing ties to small groups of talented individuals as he had in the 1930s and 1940s. As a result, it appeared during this later period that he switched from one enthusiasm to another, failing to connect each activity with the others in a way that illuminated the whole. Yet it can be argued that by the late 1970s or early 1980s, James had managed to concentrate once again on the fundamentals of his politics, imparting a belief in the creative power of the masses through conversations and formal interviews held in his small flat in London's Brixton area. Three documents in particular may be seen as emblematic of James's failure to go beyond what he had achieved in the area of Marxist theory in the wartime and early post-war period. The first, Marxism 1963, is the transcription of a speech delivered at a meeting of Solidarity, the British counterpart of the French organization Socialisme ou Barbarie. By the early 1960s, both groups were backing away from the independent Marxism these groups had advanced in the 1950s. Guided by the writings of Cornelius Castoriadis, they maintained that Marxist historical materialism could no longer explain the central dynamics of really existing capitalism. For Solidarity, Marxists had underestimated the power and autonomy of state bureaucracy and were wedded to an outdated conception of politics which valorized class struggle over and above the needs of society as a whole. That's a very weird explanation of the politics of solidarity. Solidarity was first and foremost about the self-activity of the working class. It was not, it did, however, what is true is that they did try to elaborate a larger critique of hierarchical, non-democratic social life in general, which included things like sexual relationships between men and women, the family, ethnic and racial conflicts, and all those kinds of ethnic and racial hierarchies. They moved from a mere criticism of like hierarchy in production and class society to a generalized critique of hierarchy. So there is a degree to which there is like a step away from like, I don't know, Marxism. It's very restrictive, lame sense on the part of Solidarity. That's a highly limited. The idea that they like didn't still hold class struggle as an important component of their politics is misleading. In fact, if you're interested in learning more about Solidarity, I have several pieces by Maurice Brinton, who was the head of Solidarity, if you're interested. Back to the text. In addition, Solidarity members feared that Marxism was hopelessly compromised by the experience of Stalinism in the Soviet Union. Castoriadis himself had come to believe that Marxist conception of economics was tainted by a theoretically unsustainable account of value in crisis, and argued that, quote, neo-paleo-Marxists, end quote, had lost sight of the decisive developments taking place in the post-war period. Footnote. In the third volume of Selected Political and Social Writings, Castoriadis' translator and editor summarizes his position, quote, that beyond the workplace, political activity on the part of the industrial proletariat in Western countries had disappeared, that privatization, consumerism, and the bureaucratization of all aspects of people's lives were becoming the rule, that youth and women would be in the forefront of those entering into action against these processes as they and others came to express a tendency toward autonomy and their invention of new forms of living, and that new revolutionary explosions would not replicate in reality the already false Marxist-Leninist model of, quote, economic contradictions, end quote, leading to demands for the dictatorship of a party advocating nationalization and planning, but rather would express unforeseeable attempts by all strata to reconstruct their lives in democratic grassroots fashion, end quote. See David Ames Curtis's foreword to Cornelius Castoriadis, Recommencing the Revolution, From Socialism to the Autonomous Society, published in 1993. Back to the text. While James would have accepted and may have anticipated much of this analysis, he retained, as Castoriadis insisted, a, quote, fidelity to traditional Marxism above all else, ... end quote. See Cornelius Castoriadis for a new orientation, published in Recommencing the Revolution, end footnote. In Marxism 1963, James sought to show that Marxism was indeed capable of theoretical renewal and development, that Marx's writings could still be used to illuminate the central features of a world that was admittedly very different from that of a century past. The key for James was that Marx was committed to a genuinely revolutionary politics. Marx understood that capitalism was in a constant process of transformation, but also saw that the abolition of oppression and exploitation would require a thoroughgoing overhaul of modern practices and institutions. James asserted that the major Marxist theorists were continually occupied by the problem of theoretical renewal. He pointed to Lenin's last writings, dating from 1922 and 1923, when the Bolshevik leader had taken up such ideas as reforming government bureaucracy, weakening the powers of the security apparatus, and revamping the country's agricultural policy. Footnote, see CLR James 1963, Marxism 1963. For a critique of James's understanding of Lenin, again, see Matthew Quest's article on that topic on this channel. The thrust of these writings concern the need to educate the peasantry and to somehow inhibit the bureaucratization of the state. Lenin's final seemingly revisionist document suggested for James the truly critical and subversive foundations of Lenin's method. Quote, collectivization, mechanization, improvement of this or that. Lenin naturally wrote often about these things, but they were not his main concern, end quote. James, Marxism 1963. In order to renew Marxism, James told his audience that contemporary radicals had to do, quote, for 1963 what Marx did for the, quote, historical tendency of capitalist accumulation, end quote, and what Lenin did in State and Revolution, ... end quote. This meant going back to political fundamentals and attempting to, quote, draw the necessary conclusions for the advancement of the socialist conception in the world in which we live, end quote. James, Marxism 1963. Facing reality and the 1967 document The Gathering Forces were indicative of the kinds of analysis James had in mind. However, what if, as Castorius would have insisted, these, quote, necessary conclusions, end quote, invalidated Marxism's core theoretical propositions? To what extent were the categories themselves open to transformation and repudiation? Toward the end of the talk, James made it clear why he was so certain that Marxism could be renewed through revolutionary practice. Because, as the Johnson-Forrest tendency had insisted, the concentration of capital spontaneously generated working-class rebellion and solidarity. Despite the material bounty of the post-war boom, the invading socialist society still threatened to seep through the interstices of a moribund world system. Existentialism and Marxism. A talk delivered in London in 1966 represented another defense of Marxism mounted before an audience of young radicals. He had dismissed existentialism as a, quote, fad in American civilization, even as he had sympathetically discussed Kierkegaard with his friend Richard Wright. Footnote. See CLR James's article, Black Studies and the Contemporary Student, published in James at the Rendezvous of History. By the mid-1960s, existentialism was more fashionable than ever, and in his talk, James tried to meet the hot continental import halfway. He defined existentialism as an analysis that understands man, quote, not as a single individual, but as a, quote, being in the world. This was similar but not identical to Marx's notion of man as an ensemble of social relations. To their credit, existentialists recognized that large-scale modern institutions fostered a, quote, inauthentic form of existence, only by first acknowledging the inauthenticity of modern life, and then by, quote, setting his pattern towards something that is peculiar to himself, end quote. Could the individual hope to achieve something approaching a, quote, authentic existence? The reading of existential doctrine drew not only on Jean-Paul Sartre's writings, but on those of Martin Heidegger, a more austere and less politically sympathetic figure. Finding agreement in Heidegger's notion of alienation as inauthenticity, James said that a, quote, inauthentic temporality and spatiality confine a whole society and the individuals in it to the everyday experience of, quote, falling into the world, end quote, end quote. He suggested that this evocative metaphor could be used to help explain Marx's conception of the development of working-class consciousness. The capitalist mode of production itself forces workers to undergo this existential experience of, quote, falling into the void, into the world, quote, falling into the world, end quote. Only under a revolutionary democracy, where workers had secured control over the conditions and products of their labor, could the working class hope to achieve a real sense of actuality and authenticity and thereby determine or stabilize their collective relationship to the social world? James knew that Heidegger believed that the dictatorship of the proletariat would in all likelihood obliterate the individual, reconstructing impersonal institutions that would once again cut off the individual from his or her autonomous will. But James also believed that Heidegger's philosophy nicely captured certain aspects of individual alienation under capitalism. Like Marxism 1963 and Existentialism and Marxism, the Gathering Forces pamphlet was aimed at young radicals of the early New Left. What is particularly striking about this document is its pronounced third worldism. The Gathering Forces announced in no uncertain terms the centrality of the peasantry to the socialist project. Quote, 50 years ago, the October Revolution made mankind aware of the task placed in the hands of the proletariat, destroying the accepted, constantly increasing evils of capitalist society. Today, there has emerged a new force to join the proletariat, comprising of hundreds of millions. This force is engaged in the struggle to rid contemporary society of the incubus which weighs upon it and which threatens to destroy mankind itself by fratricidal struggles for power. This force is the people of the Third World, whose liberation is possible only by the destruction of the economic and cultural domination of imperialism. For us who celebrate the 50th anniversary of the October Revolution, this political emergence of the Third World is a culmination of what emerged from theory into reality in October 1917. End quote. James, with Martin Glaberman, William Gorman, and George Rawlik, The Gathering Forces, published by Facing Reality. This quotation is taken from an extract from The Gathering Forces that appears under the title Peasants and Workers in C.L.R. James' Spheres of Existence, Selected Writings. End footnote. Rawlik later reported that the four men had argued about how much strategic weight to place on the peasantry as an autonomous revolutionary agent. Footnote. Author's interview with George Rawlik, December 28, 1980. Rawlik later reported that the four men had argued about how much strategic weight to place on the peasantry as an autonomous revolutionary agent. The final version at any rate insists that it is, quote, reactionary prejudice, end quote, to assume that, quote, supposedly backward masses, end quote, cannot achieve popular sovereignty. Johnsonism never sounded more malice than when Glaberman, Gorman, James, and Rawlik wrote, quote, within 15 or 20 years we can have a totally different world society, end quote. Yeah, I don't think that the idea of so what was I going to say here? I don't think the idea of like the masses being or the peasants being like a discontented force that would be susceptible to rebelling against the existing society has anything to do with like the critique of like the notion of peasant revolution. It's the same. It's a question of whether or not an active peasantry would indeed seek not the private appropriation of previously concentrated land holdings, or put them into collective use. Yeah. I guess it's not really I don't know, maybe that's not relevant to what's being said here, but it seems relevant. It seems like they're making some kind of polemical argument against someone, but it's not said who. Clearly, post-colonial nationalism, such as that practiced by Williams' People's National Movement, would be insufficient from a radical standpoint. Quote, political independence, they argued, is only a, quote, first step. Now must come the working out of the difficult internal problems, the work relations, the connections between town and country, the utilization of popular resourcefulness, end quote. Yet not all nationalists in the underdeveloped world favored, quote, ever centralizing bureaucrats, end quote, over the, quote, resourcefulness of local initiative, end quote. James et al. The Gathering Forces. In the final section entitled, What is Socialism?, the authors declared that Castro's regime had made impressive gains. Quote, The Cuban Revolution indicates the road to this realm of freedom. The Cuban Revolution does so in the fact that it begins to do away with commodity production. It is pulverizing the myths about how the fate of people is presumed to be backward, must wait for their salvation upon the graciousness of the great capitalist states, end quote. The gathering forces. Some have argued that James was inconsistent applying his perspective. Footnote. The British writer David Widgery criticized James for being, quote, insufficiently consistent in applying his own criteria for socialist self-emancipation to Nkrumah, Castro, and other revolutionary nationalists, end quote. See David Widgery, A Meeting with Comrade James, published in 1980, featured in Bull's edited volume, C.L.R. James's Life and Work. From my perspective, this seems, what Widgery is saying here is completely spot on. For the time being, the authors had set aside the notion of permanent revolution that had guided James's writings from the Black Jacobins to modern politics. Having only recently stressed the role of class struggle in the point of production, the quartet now describes socialism as a matter of synthesizing distinct traditions. Quote, what is chosen from Europe is the signal heritage of the Hungarian Revolution, the Workers' Council's direct democracy. What is selected from the Cuban Revolution is national self-assertion and now a vision of the socialist future of mankind. What is selected from the European heritage as a whole is the notion of human activity, economic, political, and social, and the work of Marx, the vision of humanistic societies, end quote. The gathering forces. Side note, for those who don't know, that the initial impetus of the Cuban Revolution was not socialist in character. It only went into a socialist direction, to my understanding, when it became apparent that the Soviet Union was the only world power. The Soviet Union would accept the autonomy of the national independence of Cuba, and the United States would not. In retrospect, the period from around 1967 to 76 was a dramatic high point for the international left, and although the gathering forces Janus-faced combination of command economy third worldism and first world Marxian humanism may have fundamentally breached the founding principles of American Johnsonism, it nevertheless seemed in tune with the anarchic and contradictory political temper of the times. The late 60s and early to mid-70s were the years of the Tet Offensive, from the Tet Offensive in South Vietnam and the May events in France to the, quote, revolution of carnations in Portugal and the rising tide of citizens' action movements in Germany. This was the period in which the New Left and environmental parties were able to affix themselves onto the political landscape in a number of European countries. In the West Indies, leftist study groups and independent radicals, some of them attached to social democratic formations, such as the Jamaican People's National Party, managed to influence political discourse and even public policy. Other third world liberation movements from Angola to the Philippines and from Nicaragua to Tanzania exploited political openings of one kind or another to launch bold military offensives and to sometimes launch, quote, anti-imperialist regimes. Even in the United States, a culture of tolerant individualism and mass opposition to the Vietnam War spawned a revived leftist discourse and, quote, countercultural institutions. One of the less appealing aspects of this period, however, was the resurgence of a virulent sectarianism which divided black Marxist-Leninists from cultural Pan-Africanists, anarchists from neo-Marxists, and liberal feminists from socialist feminists and radical feminists. I would be very cautious about these kind of distinctions here. I don't think the fault line was between anarchists and so-called neo-Marxist. I do believe, though, that in the New Left, there's different strains of it. And I think the dominant one, or what came to be dominant, at least in the United States, was the third worldist variety. and the other would be the libertarian variety. I think there's a world of distinction between, say, I don't know, the Black Panther Party, for instance, and Solidarity. And there's there's a very good article on this channel by Christoph Rangeli that reviews a book from Germany titled From Adorno to Mao, which kind of like chronicles this tension between the libertarian, anti-authoritarian wing of the New Left and the third worldist, guerrillaist, neo-Stalinist politics of the other part of the New Left. The student worker uprising in France in May to June 1968 was perhaps the most explosive movement of all. The May events were set off by protests centered in urban centers over the poor conditions and prospects French students faced as a social group. Thousands of students participated in marches and other public demonstrations demanding an overhaul of the nation's system of higher education. Radicalized by the heavy-handed response of the French authorities and police, student demonstrators helped ignite a national factory-based general strike involving over 10 million workers. Even though socialist and communist leaders feared the subversive and, quote, irrational aspects of the student movement, their working-class constituents were inspired to raise, quote, irresponsible demands for shorter work weeks, better working conditions, and in some cases, autogestion, the democratization of industry. In a few regions, students and workers collaborated on individual projects, while in other areas, trade unionists refused to even talk to outsiders who were regarded as middle class and, quote, unserious. The general strike lost steam as the French President Charles de Gaulle moved to reestablish authority by promising social reforms and new elections. Traditional parties on the left hoped that their cause would gain power at the ballot box, but de Gaulle was re-elected president, which cemented the return to, quote, normalcy. Commenting on these tumultuous events through a series of letters published in Facing Reality's newspaper, Speak Out, James claimed that the lesson of May 68 was that socialism was once more on the political agenda. He insisted that the, quote, national state must be destroyed, and the only way that can be done is the breakup of all bourgeois institutions and their replacement by socialist institutions, end quote. It seems like a very contradictory thing to the promotion of national states in James's third worldism. The French people had demonstrated that they were, quote, ready to take over society and to form new institutions, end quote. Dramatically overstating the potential for radical change, James argued that the, quote, world revolution in 1968 has entered into what could be a decisive and final stage. De Gaulle is an episode where the Tsar and Kerensky judge the serious De Gaulle is an episode, as were the Tsar and Kerensky, judge the seriousness and understanding of a babbler, pundit, by what he makes of this. De Gaulle is Nicholas, Kerensky and Kornilov, all in one, end quote. James, World Revolution, 1968. In a letter written a few months later, James described what he found when he visited Paris in December 1968, some 30 years after his library work on San Domingo. The impression he gained was that the masses were highly charged by the concept of autogestion. However, he backed away from some of his earlier predictions, noting that the, quote, creation of new institutions must seem, even in the minds of the working class, a task which is beyond the immediate possibility, end quote. James. Notes on France. Yet, James insisted that the restoration of social consensus was a temporary affair. Whatever their public rhetoric, union leaders and politicians in France recognized that their world could quite easily come undone again. When society was ready, it would seize the day. As James had written earlier, quote, we do not make the revolution to achieve the socialist society. The socialist society makes the revolution, end quote. James. Which again is a distinction between the nationalist rhetoric, right? It kind of seems like from things we just heard, at least from my humble white boy opinion, it seems that James, what James was just saying, was that national independence and the establishment of the state was a first step, and then you build the socialist society, as opposed to some kind of like immediate communization or something like that. But again, that just seems like a basic observation. Not to say that you need to have the same politics for every single place, but it seems like there's some pretty serious inconsistencies here. Revolutionary rhetoric filled the meeting halls of black radicals as well as student Marxists. James's stature as a historian of slave revolution and as a leading 1930s Pan-Africanist gave James a certain amount of credibility in North America and Africa. The New York Times sought out his opinion on the Marxist nationalist rift that the newspaper described as, quote, the chief development in black thought since the civil rights movement culminated in black power, end quote. Footnote. Black Academy presents awards. The New York Times, September 21st, 1970, end footnote. Black nationalists were said to downplay the importance of class conflict in capitalist economies, while one African-American Marxist characterized the nationalists as being obsessed with, quote, how many kings we had in Africa, end quote. Footnote. Black intellectuals divided over ideological direction, published in New York Times, April 28th, 1975. A cultural nationalist writing in the pages of Black Scholar asserted that for some black intellectuals, quote, their turn towards Marxism has represented a way out, a way to take off their African clothes, change back their names, refry their hair, pick up white friends again, end quote. Footnote, Black Scholar, September 1970, end footnote. With each side claiming to be anti-capitalist and critical of the Soviet Union, however, certain common assumptions link the two camps. James told the reporter that from the Times, that too much emphasis was being placed on symbolic issues. He pointed out that in the 1930s, London-based black activists had been able to set aside their differences to work together in the International African Service Bureau and other organizations. Footnote. He made the same point in letters to Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, the, quote, Black Power advocate and one-time leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, end footnote. The first 5 Pan-African Congresses, he noted, were models of united action. It was the inspiration of the 5th Pan-African Congress held in Manchester in 1945 that James had in mind when he helped issue the call for his 6th Congress in 1973 in association with H. Rap Brown, Shirley Graham Du Bois, Amy Jacques Garvey, and others. Their document urged that the Congress address 3 specific themes: economic independence, scientific and technical cooperation, and the liberation of South Africa. James suggested that the Congress focus in particular on the concept of, quote, self-reliance. By this, James referred to the idea that the, quote, future of Africa must depend upon the Africans relying on themselves and using what they have and seeking what they want with their own conception, end quote. James. Footnote. Quote, CLR James, Black World, 1974, page 22, end footnote. A variety of individuals and organizations agreed that a new Congress would be useful, and in the fall of 1974, Dr. Julius Nyerere, the head of the state of Nyerere, I don't know how to say that guy's name, the head of the state of Tanzania, hosted the Congress in Dar es Salaam with attendance exceeding 3,000 people. Julius Nyerere, I'm not sure how to say it. I mean, let's see if Google Translate will tell us anything. How to pronounce
Julius Nyerere.
Julius Nyerere lived from 1922 to 1999 and was a Tanzanian anti-colonial activist, politician, and political theorist. Julius Nyerere governed Tanganyika as prime minister from 1961 to 1962, and then as president from 1962 to 1964, after which he led its successor state, Tanzania, as president from 1964 to 1985. Julius Nyerere was a founding member and chair of the Tanganyika African National Campaign, TANU party, and its successor, Chama cha Mapinduzi, from 1954 to 1990. Ideologically an African nationalist and African socialist, Julius Nyerere promoted a political philosophy known as Ujamaa. Born in Butiama, Mara, then in the British colony of Tanganyika, Nyerere was the son of a Zanaki chief. After completing his schooling, he studied at Makerere College in Uganda and then Edinburgh University in Scotland. In 1952, Julius Nyerere returned to Tanganyika, married, and worked as a school teacher. In 1954, Julius Nyerere helped form TANU, through which Nyerere campaigned for Tanganyikan independence from the British Empire. Influenced by the Indian independence leader Mahatma Gandhi, Nyerere preached nonviolent protest to achieve this aim. Elected to the Legislative Council in the 1958-59 elections, Nyerere then led TANU to victory at the 1960 general election, becoming prime minister. Negotiations with the British authorities resulted in Tanganyikan independence in 1961. In 1962, Tanganyika became a republic, with Nyerere elected as its first president. His administration pursued decolonization and the Africanization of the civil service while promoting unity between indigenous Africans and the country's Asian and European minorities. Julius Nyerere encouraged the formation of a one-party state and unsuccessfully pursued the Pan-Africanist formation of an East African federation with Uganda and Kenya. A 1963 mutiny within the army was suppressed with British assistance. Following the Zanzibar Revolution of 1964, the island of Zanzibar was unified with Tanganyika to form Tanzania. After this, Nyerere placed a growing emphasis on national self-reliance and socialism. Although Julius Nyerere's socialism differed from that promoted by Marxism-Leninism, Tanzania developed close links with Mao Zedong's China. In 1967, Julius Nyerere issued the Arusha Declaration, which outlined his vision of Ujamaa. Banks and other major industries and companies were nationalized, education and healthcare were significantly expanded, renewed emphasis was placed on agricultural development through the formation of communal farms, although these reforms hampered food production and left areas dependent on food aid. His government provided training and aid to anti-colonialist groups fighting white minority rule through southern Africa, and oversaw Tanzania's 1978 to 1979 war with Uganda, which resulted in the overthrow of Ugandan President Idi Amin. Idi Amin is who gave the hijackers of that plane that stationed at Entebbe with Palestinian and German, far leftist. He gave them refuge. Idi Amin was an admirer of Hitler. That was the operation where the I can't remember what the forces are. Maybe it was the Mossad. I don't think it was the Mossad, but whatever. The Israel freed the Jewish prisoners that were separated from the non-Jewish prisoners, or the Israeli prisoners, which means the same thing. And in that fight, in that operation, Benjamin Netanyahu's brother died. I think it was Yanni Netanyahu. But that's just a side note. That is who decided where that's the government that the Palestinian commandos and the German far leftists decided to cooperate with was Idi Amin, one of the most vicious dictators in modern African history. Anyway, that's just a side note. In 1985, Nyerere stood down and was succeeded by Ali Hassan Mwinyi, who reversed many of Nyerere's policies. He remained chair of Chama cha Mapinduzi until 1990, supporting a transition to a multi-party system, and later served as mediator in attempts to end the Burundian civil war. Nyerere was a controversial figure. Across Africa, Julius Nyerere had gained widespread respect as an anti-colonialist, and in power received praise for ensuring that, unlike many of its neighbors, Tanzania remained stable and unified in the decades following independence. Julius Nyerere's construction of the one-party state and use of detention without trial led to accusations of dictatorial governance, while he has also been blamed for economic mismanagement. Julius Nyerere is held in deep respect within Tanzania, where he is often referred to by the Swahili honorific Mwalimu teacher and described as the, quote, father of the nation. Back to the text. The actual Congress was a disappointment, however. No single theme provided the meeting with a coherent focus, and many sessions were marred by sectarian infighting between nationalists and Marxists. Sectarian infighting, as you know, I don't particularly like those terms, sectarian and infighting, because they kind of are used a lot in a very meaningless way. It doesn't suggest like the actual real contradictions between Marxism and nationalism, at least in this case. There is significant difference. 2 weeks before its scheduled opening, James was informed that organizations from the Caribbean that were not officially sanctioned by their governments, such as the New Jewel Movement of Grenada and Trinidad's National Joint Action Committee, could not attend. That effectively excluded dissidents from a number of countries and lent the authority of the Pan-African movement to regimes that arguably betrayed the aspirations of the West Indian peoples. Adamantly opposed to this administrative fiat, James refused to lend his name to a meeting he had canvassed for so energetically. Quote, I went to Nigeria, I went to Ghana, I went somewhere else in Africa, I can't remember. I went to the Caribbean twice, I went to Guyana, I went to Trinidad, I went to Jamaica twice. I traveled all over the United States. I went to the West Coast. I would have 8 or 10 meetings over a weekend between Sacramento, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, but I know those Caribbean governments as well as anybody else, and I was not going to be a representative of any one of them, end quote. James. Footnote. C.L.R. James, toward the 7th, the Pan-African Congress, Past, Present, and Future, reprinted in Michael Manley, Not for Sale, published in and republished in At the Rendezvous of History. At the Rendezvous of Victory. The speech was delivered at the First Congress of All African Writers in Dakar, Senegal, on the 8th of January, 1976. I should look up some of these movements, actually. The New Jewel Movement of Grenada. The New Joint Endeavor for Welfare, Education, and Liberation, or New Jewel Movement, was a Marxist-Leninist vanguard party in the Caribbean island nation of Grenada that was led by Maurice Bishop. Established in 1973, the NJM issued its manifesto prior to Grenada being granted independence from the United Kingdom in 1974. The New Jewel Movement took control of Grenada with a bloodless coup in 1979 and ruled by decree as the People's Revolutionary Government until 1983. In October of that year, Maurice Bishop and 7 of his associates were killed by paramilitaries affiliated with hardline elements in his own party. Those elements formed a military government which was quickly deposed by a U.S. invasion later in October. Back to the text. Who else was the other? What was the other one? Trinidad's National Joint Action Committee. It just says, the Wikipedia just says, or the introduction says, National Joint Action Committee is a political party in Trinidad and Tobago. Its ideology includes black nationalism, black power, black pride, Afrocentrism, Pan-Africanism, Marxism. Back to the text. Quote, because he believed that solidarity between Africans and peoples in the diaspora must be forged among mass-based revolutionary groups rather than among governments, end quote, writes Consuelo Lopez, quote, James called on all delegates to boycott the conference, end quote. Consuelo Lopez notes that Nyerere phoned James at his hotel in Washington, D.C. in a futile effort to change his mind. Footnote. Consuelo Lopez, C.L.R. James, The Rhetoric of a Defiant Warrior. Unpublished dissertation, Indiana University, 1983. Soon after the Sixth Congress had taken place, James dusted off a proposal that he had batted around a decade earlier and called for a Seventh Pan-African Congress that could promote the idea of federation, not only in the East Caribbean but also in West Africa. He argued that the state was too fragile to cope with the pressures of underdevelopment. Federal arrangements could encourage Pan-African unity and cultural autonomy and find ways to promote sustainable economic development. Yet although this theme had been broached in Dar es Salaam, it failed to rally the participants or to convince politicians to abandon their commitment to the nation-state. It was in his capacity as a Pan-Africanist that James was asked to speak on the subject of Black Studies in 1969 at Federal City College, now the University of the District of Columbia, where James obtained a teaching position. The talk was one of many he gave throughout the late 1960s and 1970s, and it exemplified his virtues both as an orator and as an independent Marxist. It also revisited the distinctive position he had articulated a decade earlier in the context of debates in the West Indies. Quote, Black Studies in the Contemporary Student, end quote, opened on a quintessentially Jamesian note, quote, I have to make certain things clear from the beginning. I do not recognize any distinctive nature of Black Studies. Not today, 1969. However, the history of the United States being what it has been and what it still is, there's a serious struggle going on between the advocates of one lot of Black Studies and the advocates of another lot, and therefore I am compelled for the time being to take sides. ... End quote. James. Black Studies in the Contemporary Student, reprinted in James at the Rendezvous of Victory. And footnote. There were, on the one hand, advocates of an autonomous, quote, nation-building, Black Studies movement, which James was critical of, and advocates of a sort of pacification strategy where Black Studies would play the same role in the universities that Nixon's, quote, Black capitalism program was designed to play in the community. James was an opponent of the latter, which he summarized as saying, quote, what you really need to do is to get the kind of education which will fit you for jobs 11% of the top jobs and your 11% of the middle jobs. 2, end quote. Footnote. James, Black Studies in the Contemporary Student, end footnote. While James' overall position was neither Black nationalist nor liberal accommodationist, James clearly felt for tactical reasons that he had to side with the nationalists. As he stated toward the beginning of the talk, quote, a man like Rat Brown says things that I can't imagine my saying, but if anybody wants to criticize Rat Brown, especially people in England, I tell them, quote, you shut up and leave him alone. What he says and what risks he chooses to run, that is his business, comes from his past and his experience of the people around him. End quote. End quote, James. Footnote, James, Black Studies in the Contemporary Student. Or, as James remarked at the conclusion of his talk, quote, life presents you with some strange difficulties, and at times you have to run with the hare and hunt with the hounds, end quote, James. Militants like Rat Brown voiced the concern of many urban African Americans, and however critical one might be of certain manifestations of Black nationalism, one had to accept that it was a social movement with a history, logic, and appeal of its own. As James had argued in his seminal document, The Revolutionary Answer to the Negro Problem in the USA, there was an intrinsically radical dynamic to Black nationalist movements, one that Marxists should learn to appreciate and even accommodate on its own terms. Furthermore, the Black Studies movement was correct in insisting on the relevance of the Black experience to the history of the West. As he argued in his lecture, quote, to talk to me about black studies as if it's something that concerned black people is an utter denial. This is the history of Western civilization. I can't see it otherwise, end quote. James, Black Studies and the Contemporary Student. If it took a nationalist perspective to challenge more abound conceptions of history, then so be it. This is not to suggest, however, that James's position was one of passively accepting whatever demands were raised by a given social movement. For one thing, the impassioned discourse of 1960s-style Black Power movements was not exactly to his taste. Quote, I am not boasting about black is beautiful, end quote, James emphasized. Quote, please, I don't go in for that. If other black people want to, that's their affair. If they say, quote, black is beautiful, quote, black is ugly, black is whatever they like, I'm concerned with historical facts, end quote. James, Black Studies and the Contemporary Student. The phrase, quote, historical facts was the critical one. James's interest was in interrogating and opening up the study of Western societies, in strengthening and deepening our collective understanding and appreciation of history as a totality, and not in Western civ bashing. An interesting light on his perspective is cast in a section when he discusses his conversations with West Indian graduate students in London. Quote, I am in London and I see some of the students and I ask one of them, what are you doing? He says, I'm doing a study of T.S. Eliot. I say, fine. I ask another West Indian student, what are you doing? He says, I'm working for the PhD. I say, what are you doing? He says, I'm studying D.H. Lawrence. I say, very nice. The most fantastic of them all is another fellow who tells me he is doing Joseph Conrad. Conrad is a Pole who wrote in the English language and wrote very well indeed, end quote. James. At this point, the listener might have supposed that James advised these students to probe, say, the history of the Haitian slave revolution or the life of Marcus Garvey, but his advice went in a rather different direction. Quote, but why should these West Indian students be doing D.H. Lawrence, Joseph Conrad, and T.S. Eliot when a man like Alexander Dumas, the father, is there? I want to tell you that those novels, e.g. Dumas' Count of Monte Cristo and The Three Musketeers, did. After the French Revolution, Europe and the rest of the world broke out in what was known as the Romantic period, which meant a tremendous expansion of the individual personality of the ordinary man. Previous to the French Revolution, men lived according to a certain discipline, a certain order. The French Revolution broke with that, and people began to live more individual, more experimental, more romantic lives. Personality. Among the forces which contributed to that were the romantic poets and novelists of the day, and one of them stands higher in the popular field, in the expectation and understanding of the people of those days, than Alexander Dumas. What I'm saying is, not only did the black people contribute, not only did they fight in the ranks, but in forging the kind of lives which people lived afterwards. One of the foremost men is a man from the Caribbean. How do I make that into black studies? I can't. No. I can understand some universities saying, quote, we are going to study the lives and works of black men who have not been done before, end quote. That I understand. But to make it black studies? End quote. An instructive passage. As far as one could tell, its author had no special interest in the works of Alexander Dumas. Whenever I think of Alexander Dumas, I think of the end scene of, not the end scene, but one of the climaxes of Django Unchained, where King Schultz, Christoph Waltz's character, asks Calvin Candy, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, what Alexander Dumas would have think of him feeding a slave to his dogs. As he did in the beginning of the movie, and the slave's name was D'Artagnan, which is from the Three Musketeers, and he says, he wouldn't have approved. And Calvin Candy calls him like a soft-hearted Frenchie, and he says Alexander Dumas is black, and then Calvin Candy looks so stupid. Alexander Dumas lived from 1802 to 1870, also known as Alexandre Dumas Pire, was a French novelist and playwright. Dumas' works have been translated into many languages, and he is one of the most widely read French authors. Many of his historical novels of adventure were originally published as serials, including The Count of Monte Cristo, The Three Musketeers, 20 Years Later, and The Vicomte of Bragelonne, 10 years later. Since the early 20th century, his novels have been adapted into nearly 200 films. Prolific in several genres, Dumas began his career by writing plays, which were successfully produced from the first. He wrote numerous magazine articles and travel books. His published works total 100,000 pages. In the 1840s, Dumas founded the Théâtre Historique in Paris. Dumas' father, General Thomas Alexandre Dumas David de la Paeterie, was born in the French colony of San Domingo, present-day Haiti, to Alexandre Antoine David de la Paeterie, a French nobleman, and Marie Cassette Dumas, an African slave. At age 14, Thomas Alexander was taken by his father to France, where he was educated in a military academy and entered the military for what became an illustrious career. Alexander acquired work with Louis Philippe, Duke of Orleans, then as a writer, a career that led to his early success. Decades later, after the election of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte in 1851, Dumas fell from favor and left France for Belgium, where he stayed for several years. Dumas moved to Russia for a few years and then to Italy. In 1861, Dumas founded and published the newspaper Le Indépendant, which supported Italian unification. Dumas returned to Paris in 1864. English playwright Watts Phillips, who knew Dumas in his later life, described Dumas as, quote, the most generous, large-hearted being in the world. He also was the most delightful, amusing, and egotistical creature on the face of the earth. His tongue was like a windmill. Once set in motion, you would never know when he would stop, especially if the theme was himself, end quote. Back to the text. But James called attention to the Romantics' West Indian roots to highlight the intersection and interdependence of Western traditions and the African diaspora. This passage is also instructive for what it says about how James could upset listeners' expectations, be they nationalist or, quote, Eurocentric. There's something pointed about the suggestion that Dumas' romantic individualism could be of significance to the Black Studies movement. Footnote. But it was consistent with the friendly references he made to Abraham Lincoln as he set forth a research agenda for the Black Studies movement. James evinced a tremendous fondness of the American president, emphasizing Lincoln's evolution as a politician and showing how the commander-in-chief had arrived at a, quote, new conception of what black people were, end quote, in the context of their performance in the Civil War. Quote, the Democratic creed had worthy expounders before him, end quote, James admitted, but he went on to claim that, quote, none ever had so dramatic a stage, so comprehensive an audience, end quote. See the article Abraham Lincoln, the 150th anniversary of his birth, and Black Studies in the Contemporary Student, both in Grimshaw's edited volume, The C.L.R. James Reader. Back to the text. End footnote. End footnote. Where am I? Finally, the passage reasserted the value of, quote, history over something called, quote, Black Studies. Ultimately, it was the contribution that the latter could make to the former which excited James. Black Studies, per se, held no intrinsic interest for him. Given an uncertain bank balance, the absence of a network similar to the ones that sustained him during the 1930s and 1940s, and his declining health, it is perhaps not surprising that James mostly produced short pieces in this period. Footnote. Two exceptions are the Atlantic slave trade and slavery, Some interpretations of their significance in the development of the United States and the Western world. Amistad 1, John A. Williams and Charles F. Harris's edited volume. Vintage Books, 1970, and The West Indian Intellectual, the introductory essay to a new edition of J. Thomas's Fraudacity, published in 19... Sorry, 1 second. One second. Never mind. Anyway, end footnote. It seemed increasingly unlikely, for example, that he would ever finish the projected book on Shakespeare. One of the last books to appear during his lifetime was Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution, much of which had been composed in 1958 to 1960. In this new edition of Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution, C.L.R. James tells the history of the socialist revolution led by Kwame Nkrumah, the first president and prime minister of Ghana. Although James wrote it in the immediate post-independence period around 1958, James did not publish until nearly 20 years later, when he added a series of his own letters, speeches, and articles from the 1960s. Although Nkrumah led the revolution, James emphasizes that it was a popular mass movement fundamentally realized by the actions of everyday Ghanaians. Moreover, James shows that Ghana's independence movement was an exceptional moment in global revolutionary history. It moved revolutionary activity to the African continent and employed new tactics not seen in previous revolutions. Featuring a new introduction by Leslie James, an unpublished draft of C.L.R. James' introduction to the 1977 edition, and correspondence, this definitive edition of Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution offers a revised understanding of Africa's shaping of freedom movements and insight into the possibilities of decolonial futures. Again, that was the description of Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution. Back to the text. Portions of the manuscript turned up in different publications in the 1960s, and as James revealed in a letter to Martin Glaberman, his initial expectations for the book were quite high. Quote, "I am usually an exceptionally good judge of my own work," end quote, James wrote, quote, "leaning towards underestimation instead of overestimation of the work. About the book it is, I have not the slightest doubt, the best book that has appeared on Africa," end quote. James, to Martin Glaberman, March 2nd, 1965. Consciously highlighting the question of political leadership as he had done in the Black Jacobins and elsewhere, James's book on Ghana devotes considerable attention to the changing nature of Nkrumah's relationship to the popular constituency of national independence and self-emancipation. As leader of the Convention People's Party, Nkrumah became the head of the new West African state, Ghana. For the first few years, he was a genuinely popular figure, but he used his personal charisma to consolidate his control over the state. Under his centralizing administration, the bureaucracy gained considerable leverage over the national economy, and Nkrumah eventually turned from folk hero into dictator. In 1966, the one remaining countervailing power center within the state, the armed forces initiated a coup while Nkrumah was touring European capitals. Quote, "The most astonishing aspect," writes the British historian Trevor Jones, quote, "was that in it, bracket, the coup, took place at all." Quote, "was not that it, bracket, the coup, and bracket, took place at all, but that the ruling party and its integral wings collapsed so completely within the course of a few hours, ... end quote. Footnote, cited in Manning Marble, C.L.R. James and Nkrumah. Manning Marble is one of the big biographies of Malcolm X. Back to the text. The Western press reported that Nkrumah's abrupt fall from power was a consequence of two factors: economic mismanagement and the government's failure to implement its social program. In a subsequent comparative analysis, Emanuel Wallerstein argued that post-colonial one-party states typically undergo a process whereby once the initial period of revolutionary momentum is past, party cadres abandon the anti-colonial party in favor of state employment. In the case of Ghana, this had the effect of cutting the regime off from outside criticism. Footnote: Emanuel Wallerstein, Decline of the Party in Single-Party African States, published in Joseph Le Palombara and Martin Weiner's Political Parties and Political Developments. Political Parties and Political Development, published in 1972. This book appears to have been published or is currently available with Princeton University Press, and the description is very short. It says, a group of specialists trace the origins and development of political parties, explore their impact on the system in which they exist, and raise new questions about the potential role of parties. End footnote. Back to the text, end footnote. In Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution, James emphasizes neither economic mismanagement nor the dynamic of one-party rule in his analysis of Nkrumah's fall from power. Instead, Nkrumah's examination of the process leading from independence to military coup highlights certain flaws in the CPP's leadership personality. CPP leader's personality. Nkrumah's vanity and paranoia, Nkrumah's failure to delegate responsibility or to draw on the energies of his numerous supporters throughout the country. While much of the historical narrative that the book provides is informative, its detailed account of the emergence of the Convention People's Party and the struggle for, quote, positive action is particularly engaging. His overall analysis could have benefited from the type of comparative framework that Wallerstein employs. In Part 2 of Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution, the author discusses his own dealings with Nkrumah, and this is by far the most interesting half of the text. What becomes clear is that James felt that he had to think carefully about how, where, and when to criticize the regime. In 1960, for example, James gave a speech in the capital city of Ghana, Accra, warning of the need for being, quote, doubly and trebly an honest man, end quote, because, quote, these fellows are seeking to bribe you and corrupt you all the time, because that is the only way they can control or affect the economic life of the country, end quote. Footnote, C.L.R. James, Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution, page 176, end footnote. The phrase, quote, these fellows, end quote, referred, of course, to agents of foreign capital and outside state powers. The implied criticism easily deciphered was that these people were finding it easy to make friends and allies in the new Ghana. But in this speech, the primary responsibility for Ghana's problems was external. James did not believe that Nkrumah was to blame if multinationals and the superpowers sought to promote their own interests in Africa. Even by 1962, with Nkrumah facing heated criticism for human rights violations from domestic politicians and sympathetic observers abroad, James bent over backwards to avoid being seen as attacking a friend. Quote, I am thankful and happy to know that Africa has produced so distinguished a master of the general strategy and details of the politics of humanity in the inhuman world in which we live, end quote. He gushed privately in a letter to the Ghanese leader. His willingness to forgive Nkrumah was to be placed in a broader context where a whole generation of intellectuals lent their support to experiments of one kind or another despite signs that many of the new independent states were being run along dictatorial lines. Footnote, according to Paul Bull, James spoke highly of the Zambian leader Kenneth Kaunda. Wikipedia says Kenneth Kaunda lived from 1924 to 2021, also known as KK. was a Zambian politician who served as the first president of Zambia from 1964 to 1991. Kenneth Kaunda was at the forefront of the struggle for independence from British rule. Dissatisfied with Harry Inkumbula's leadership, Northern Rhodesian African National Congress, he broke away and founded the Zambian African National Congress, later becoming the head of the Socialist United National Independence Party. Kaunda was the first president of independent Zambia. In 1973, following tribal and inter-party violence, all political parties except the UNIP were banned through an amendment of the Constitution after the signing of the Coma Declaration. At the same time, Kaunda oversaw the acquisition of majority stakes in key foreign-owned companies. The 1973 oil crisis and a slump in export revenues put Zambia in a state of economic crisis. International pressure forced Kaunda to change the rules that had kept him in power. Multi-party elections took place in 1991, in which Frederick Chiluba, the leader of the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy, ousted Kaunda. He was briefly stripped of Zambian citizenship in 1998, but the decision was overturned 2 years later in 2000. Back to the text and footnote. After the situation in Ghana deteriorated further and Nkrumah had failed to respond to private letters, James finally published a critical account of Nkrumah's leadership in an article in the Trinidad Evening News in 1964. Noting that Nkrumah had been the target of 2 assassination attempts, he said that, quote, something was wrong with his regime which demanded serious attention, otherwise people don't shoot, end quote. Quoted in James, Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution. James never heard from Nkrumah again. Retreating from the peasant-centered analysis advanced in the gathering forces, James's analysis of Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution placed less emphasis on the peasantry as a revolutionary force and stressed the need to transform the international system as a whole. Returning to the analysis of permanent revolution that he had advanced in world revolution elsewhere, he maintained that, quote, without economic, technological, and educational help and encouragement from the advanced areas of Western civilization, Africa will go up and go down in flames, and heaven only knows when that conflagration will be halted, end quote. James, Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution. In the 1960 speech given at Accra, James had argued, quote, we should be careful in dealing with these matters to call things by their correct names, and classical socialism, and it is always good to begin with the classic definition, demands a very highly developed technological and industrial society. It demands people who for some years have been familiar with the latest developments of modern science and technology. It demands a popular population which is in its majority industrial workers, ... end quote. James. Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution. At the same time, more could have been done with the available human and technological resources. James suggested that Nkrumah's greatest flaw was in some respects similar to Toussaint's, that of failing to trust his supporters to tap into their democratic spirit. Footnote, quote, Africa, and other countries as well, but Africa in particular, will go crashing from precipice to precipice unless the plans for economic development are part of a deep philosophical concept of what the mass of the African people need. This is where Nkrumah failed, end quote. James, Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution, page 188, end footnote. To focus on James's partial critique of Nkrumah's political practice once he gained power, however, is to overlook the inflated claims James had initially made concerning Nkrumah's importance as a world historic individual. Quote, I want to say here, end quote, James told the audience in Accra, quote, and I want to say it most emphatically, that when the time comes in the history of international socialism and the revolution to overthrow capitalism is written, at the head, of course, will be names like Marx. There will also be names like Engels. There will be the name of Lenin. But a place will have to be found for Kwame Nkrumah, drowned by applause and shouts. I say today, the center of the world revolutionary struggle is here in Accra, Ghana, end quote. James. A certain amount of oratorical oratorical excess would have been natural on such an occasion, but the speech gives one the sense of how much James had invested in a certain image of Nkrumah's role on the historical stage. A reviewer of the Times Literary Supplement rightly complained that James had demolished the, quote, sentimental imperialist myth of African political development, end quote, only to replace it with a sentimental Pan-African myth about Nkrumah as Lenin, Gandhi, and Toussaint L'Ouverture, all rolled into one. Footnote, see Isabel Appia, Times Literary Supplement, December 2nd, 1977. The book's last chapter is taken from the second edition to A History of Pan-African Revolt, published in 1969, where the author goes over the top in celebrating Nyeri's theory of Ujamaa, African socialism. Quote, it is sufficient to say that socialist thought has seen nothing like this since the death of Lenin in 1924, and its depth, range, and repercussions which flow from it go far beyond the Africa which gave it birth, ... end quote. Wikipedia says Ujamaa was a socialist ideology that formed the basis of Julius Nyeri's social and economic development policies in Tanzania after it gained independence from Britain in 1961. More broadly, Ujamaa may mean, quote, cooperative economics in the sense of, quote, local people cooperating with each other to provide for the essentials of living, end quote, or, quote, to build and maintain our own stores, shops, and other businesses, and to profit from them together, end quote. Back to the text and footnote. By 1977, when Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution finally appeared, the third wave of Pan-Africanism had subsided. Ghana continued to decline under military rule. Nyeri's African socialist experiment was quickly losing steam, and in general less attention was being paid to Pan-African ideals of black unity and cooperation across the diaspora. Black nationalism was on the retreat in the United States and Britain, with warring sects standing in for mass movements. Of course, vestiges of Pan-African ideology could still be found on campuses in both the advanced industrial and, quote, underdeveloped nations. However, as was the case with the international New Left, the crest of the wave had broken, ravaged by infighting, political misleadership, sheer physical exhaustion, state repression, and by the inevitable backlash that can threaten any movement for autonomy and equality. In the Caribbean, the choices seemed largely limited to PNM-style neocolonialism or Cuban statism. Clearly, a militant Pan-Africanism would be incompatible with the former and suspicious of the latter. The main exceptions to these stark options were the reformist program advanced by Michael Manley's People's National Party after its electoral triumph in Jamaica in 1972 and 1976, and in the participatory radicalism practiced by the New Jewel movement in Grenada from 1979 to 1983. Despite the brouhaha surrounding the collapse of Federation in the early 1960s, James enjoyed amicable relations with Manley's father, Norman Manley, and was broadly supportive of the program of social welfare and state-led development that the younger Manley's regime embarked on during the mid-1970s. Wikipedia says Michael Manley lived from 1924 to 1997. Michael Manley was a Jamaican politician who served as the fourth Prime Minister of Jamaica from 1972 to 1980 and from 1989 to 1992. Michael Manley championed a democratic socialist program and has been described as a populist. Michael Manley remains one of Jamaica's most popular prime ministers. Back to the text. James was also sympathetic to the fact that the People's National Party had long been allied with, quote, poets, painters, fiction writers, and cultural intellectuals, end quote. Footnote, Jervis Anderson, Onward and Upward with the Arts, Derek Walcott's Odyssey, published with the New Yorker, December 21st, 1992. Under Michael Manley's flamboyant leadership, Jamaica briefly became an international symbol of third world resistance, not only for its music and culture, but also for its redistributive economics and for Manley's friendly overtures to the Cuban government. However, the regime was beset by tremendous economic and political pressures, particularly during its second term, and when the People's National Party regained power in the late 1980s, Manley assured Western powers that he was firmly pro-enterprise and was no longer interested in joining forces with the Cubans or other radical governments. For 4 short years, Grenada's New Jewel movement led a people's revolutionary government that attempted to lead the Grenadian economy in a participatory and state socialist direction. Weird sentence there. Participatory and state socialist direction. The NJM had come to power in March 1979 in the aftermath of a mass popular uprising directed against a neo-colonial government headed by Eric Gary. Wikipedia says Eric Gary lived from 1922 to 1997. Eric Gary was the first Prime Minister of Grenada, serving after his country's independence in 1974 until his overthrow in a coup by Maurice Bishop in 1979. Eric Gary also served as head of government in pre-independence Grenada as chief minister from 1961 to 1962 and as premier from 1967 to 1974. Back to the text. The New Jewel movement had been formed in 1974 as a result of the merger of two organizations, Joint Endeavor for Welfare, Education, and Liberation, and the Movement for Assemblies of the People. The latter was led by Maurice Bishop, an articulate and popular figure who had known James in London in the 1960s, and whose politics reflected the combined influence of Black Power, Castroite, and Jamesian views. Wikipedia says Maurice Bishop lived from 1944 to 1983. Maurice Bishop was a Grenadian revolutionary and leader of the New Jewel movement, a Marxist-Leninist party that sought to prioritize socio-economic development, education, and black liberation. The New Jewel movement came to power during the 13th of March 1979 revolution, which removed Prime Minister Eric Gary from office. Maurice Bishop headed the People's Revolutionary Government of Grenada, PRG, from 1979 to 1983. In October 1983, he was deposed as Prime Minister and executed during a coup engineered by Deputy Prime Minister Bernard Coard. This quickly led to the demise of the PRG. Back to the text. As the New Jewel movement moved closer to obtaining power, it embraced a more orthodox Marxism-Leninism. Bishop told an interviewer in 1977 that the cadres of the New Jewel movement had begun to identify with the Cuban model, which he described as, quote, scientific socialism, end quote, by the mid-1970s. Footnote, Maurice Bishop speaks The Grenada Revolution and Its Overthrow, 1979 to 1983. Published by Pathfinder, which is the press of the Socialist Workers' Party of the United States, which used to be a Trotskyist organization, but moved more and more to a Castroist framework. And the description of Maurice Bishop Speaks says, the triumph of the 1979 revolution in the Caribbean island of Grenada had, quote, importance for all struggles around the world, end quote, said Maurice Bishop, its central leader. Invaluable lessons from that workers' and farmers' government overturned in a Stalinist-led coup can be found in this collection. Back to the text and footnote. Once in power, however, and with Castro's blessing, Prime Minister Bishop's People's Revolutionary Government embraced the mixed economy and implemented a series of imaginative reforms in the areas of education, health, industrial relations, and agriculture. Footnote. On the Bishop government's reform, see inter alia Steve Clark introduction to Maurice Bishop Speaks. End footnote. Tragically, in the fall of 1983, Bishop and 5 of his colleagues were interned and later executed during a palace coup by Deputy Prime Minister Bernard Coward and other New Jewel movement apparatchiks. This coup d'etat provoked a U.S. invasion which led to the installation of a regime that marched in step with U.S. interests as these were defined by the Reagan administration. Winston Bernard Coward was born in 1944. Bernard Coward is a Grenadian politician who is deputy prime minister in the People's Revolutionary Government of the New Jewel movement. Coward launched a coup within the revolutionary government and took power for 3 days until he was himself deposed by General Hudson Austin. Back to the text. In comparison to Jamaica or Grenada, post-colonial politics in Trinidad and Tobago seemed frozen under the hegemony of the People's National Movement. The parliamentary opposition, which continued to be rooted in ethnic politics, was typically noisy but rarely effective. The only major threat to Williams' rule came in 1970 when a succession of protests on behalf of Black Power led to talk of the possibility of a left-inspired military uprising. Several of the protests were led by the oil field workers' trade union and by a student-based organization, the National Joint Action Committee. Out of sheer frustration, a few radicals resorted to arson to protest against the PNM's complicity in imperialism and capitalism, and as a result, some 200 banks and government buildings, as well as residents of the U.S. Vice Council, went up in smoke in a single year, 1970. Footnote, see CLR James, The Caribbean Confrontation Begins, published in Race Today, September 1970. End footnote. Williams was able to restore order in this period by arresting Black Power leaders, by appealing to middle-class Indo-Caribbean and business interest, and by making limited concessions to popular demands. Footnote, reflecting on the state of Trinidadian politics in 1979, James described a depoliticization of the Afro-Caribbean population. James found that few people held out any hope that change could arrive through political means, either from within or from without the electoral system. See CLR James's article, Whither Trinidad and Tobago, published in Race Today, November-December 1979. End footnote. Williams was able to restore order in this period by arresting Black Power leaders, by appealing to middle-class Indo-Caribbean and business interests, and by making limited concessions to popular demands. His rule was also backed by the presence of a U.S. naval task force in Trinidad's territorial waters. Broadly speaking, James maintained a respectful and sometimes friendly stance vis-a-vis a variety of leftists in the region, including Manley and his untimely death, Maurice Bishop, and before his untimely death, Maurice Bishop. Some of his contacts dated back to his work in the PNM and the Federation movement. He had also come to know a number of academics and others through a West Indian study group that Richard Small and Norman Gervon had formed in 1962. Wikipedia says Norman P. Gervon, who lived from 1941 to 2014, was a Jamaican professor, Secretary General of the Association of Caribbean States between 2000 and 2004. Norman Gervon was in St. Andrew Parish, Jamaica. He died in 1972 in Cuba on the 9th of April 2014. After having suffered a full fall while hiking in Dominica in early 2014, he had been a member of the United Nations Committee on Development and Policy since 2009. In 2010, was appointed the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's personal representative on the Guyana-Venezuelan border controversy. He is professor emeritus at the University of the West Indies. I don't know if this is the same guy who's being referred to here or not, but that's what happened when I typed in Norman Gervon. The group met at James's house on Staverton Road in northwest London on Friday nights, which gave the Jameses the opportunity to discuss ideas and books with a promising circle of younger radicals. Participation in these Friday night sessions included future Harvard sociologist Orlando Patterson and the Guyanese scholar Walter Rodney. Wikipedia says Orlando Patterson was born in 1940. Orlando Patterson is a Jamaican-American historian and sociologist known for his work on the history of race and slavery in the United States and Jamaica, as well as the sociology of development. Orlando Patterson is currently at the John Coles Professor of Sociology at Harvard University. Orlando Patterson's 1991 book, Freedom in the Making of Western Culture, won the U.S. National Book Award for nonfiction. And Walter Rodney, who we all know, but let's look up his Wikipedia page real quick. Wikipedia says Walter Rodney lived from 1942 to 1980 and was a Guyanese historian, political activist, and academic. Walter Rodney's notable works include How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, was first published in 1972. He was assassinated in Georgetown, Guyana in 1980. Back to the text. Through these connections, James enjoyed contact with a variety of groups that had sprung up in the late 1960s and early 1970s that were influenced by the New Left and Black Power movements. These groups included the Trinidad-based New Beginnings movement, the People's Democratic Movement of St. Vincent, and the Antigua Caribbean Liberation Movement led by Tim Hector. I'm not going to look all this up. I'll look up Tim Hector. Leonard Tim Hector lived from 1942 to 2002. Tim Hector was a leftist Antiguan political leader and cricket administrator known for his opposition to the rule of the Byrd family. Back to the text. As Paget Henry has shown, at least one tendency within the latter became influenced by the worker-centric pro-spontaneity program advanced in such text as Facing Reality. Throughout this period, James was also in intermittent contact with a number of Jamaican intellectuals, some of whom were close to Manley's government. Footnote. I guess this is one that I missed. Rodney later described how he and several writers met with CLR and Selma, quote, over a period of 2 to 3 years on a fairly regular basis, end quote. James's contribution, he remembered, was, quote, a certain sense of historical analysis, ... The group might do some reading and try to understand what a text says, but James gave it that added dimension which nobody else in the group could easily acquire in being able to say, this is what Lenin was about. This is what Trotsky was doing. He had just come from this conference or this debate, or this was his specific programmatic objective when he was writing, and so on. End quote. See Walter Rodney, speaks, The Making of an African Intellectual. End footnote. And then the next footnote says, see Paget Henry, C.L.R. James, and the Antiguan Left, published in Henry and Bull's edited volume, C.L.R. James's Caribbean. The title features a dialogue held in Amherst, Massachusetts, where Rodney discussed his own political and intellectual development and exchanged views on the role of the black intellectual. End footnote. Excuse me, and back to the text. End footnote. As far as Cuba was concerned, James's attitude was usually enigmatic but occasionally uncritical. As we have seen, the first response of the correspondence group was to encourage American workers to emulate the Cuban revolutionaries, and James and his co-authors had claimed in the gathering forces that Cuba was making great strides in realizing a socialist economy. However, James rarely had any sort of detailed comment to make about Castroism or its role in the Caribbean, except to say that it reflected something larger than simply, quote, Stalinism or, quote, communism. James's description of the Cuban Revolution as, quote, peculiarly West Indian, the product of a peculiar origin and a peculiar history, end quote, which appeared in the 1963 afterword to the second edition of the Black Jacobins, may be regarded as more or less representative of his overall approach. Footnote. See C.L.R. James, From Toussaint L'Ouverture to Fidel Castro, published in the C.L.R. James Reader. James spent some time in Cuba in 1967 and 1968, participating in an international conference of, quote, revolutionary intellectuals, and convened by Cuban academics. Footnote. Author's interview with Robin Blackburn, June 6, 1992. End footnote. James's main contribution to the proceedings was to interject from the convention's floor that the category of, quote, intellectual was historically obsolete and should be, quote, abolished as a force, end quote. James. Footnote. The gist of his presentation was that the phase of the West Indian leadership of struggles in underdeveloped countries was over, and that, quote, it is in the application of this capacity to the life of the Americas and the West Indian intellectual, that the West Indian intellectual will find the necessary element for the development of culture, ... end quote. While James calls the Cuban Revolution the, quote, climax of a particular tradition in the West Indies, James goes on to say that the West Indian masses should have been, quote, formally represented, end quote, at the convention in order to help, quote, prepare the way for the abolition of the intellectuals as an embodiment of culture, end quote. James, end footnote. As the Jamaican writer Andrew Salke paints the scene, James's calculatingly provocative suggestion went over like a lead balloon. Quote, salon dead still, consternation, bewildered, silent delegates everywhere, end quote. Andrew Salke writes. Footnote. Andrew Salke, Havana Journal, published 1971, page 110. End footnote. Salke's vivid depiction of this Havana sojourn emphasizes the older man's sense of detachment even as he finds himself in, quote, excellent humor, wry and timely, end quote. Salke, Havana Journal. As he carries around art books and carefully nurses his health, James picks a rather idiotic fight with his group's hosts, who insist that it is indeed appropriate for Fidel to keep, quote, telling the people over and over again that the democratic freedom of the vacillating Cubans will not be taken away from them, end quote. Footnote, words are James's. Salke, Havana Journal, page 58. Another event goes far more smoothly, the celebration of James's 67th birthday. In attendance were the poet Aimé Césaire, Daniel Guérin, the anti-psychiatrist David Cooper, the Haitian writer René Depeste, Robert Hill, John LaRose, and approximately 30 others. Salke describes the tribute as a, quote, spontaneous and, quote, moving affair, at which James gave a short speech that was, quote, provocative, salty, and in the tradition of the man of letters, end quote. Salke, Havana Journal. On some occasions, James could be almost rapturous in praising the Cuban model. An essay titled The Birth of a Nation, written toward the end of the 1970s, ended on the following note, quote, we could have introduced another West Indian poet who, with pen and pencil, plunged into the depths of the Caribbean's harsh reality and superstition to paint the picture of the people as they are and as they feel, but we prefer the poet who begins, goodbye, Mr. Wood, goodbye, Mr. Taft, goodbye, Mr. Nixon, and ends with, quote, good morning, Fidel, end quote, end quote. James, The Birth of a Nation, published in Susan Craig's edited volume, Contemporary Caribbean, a Sociological Reader. Sporadic comments aside, the Caribbean leader that he was closest with was Walter Rodney, co-founder of the Working People's Alliance, WPA, of Guyana, and noted scholar. As we have seen, Rodney had become drawn into James's West Indian circle in London in the mid-1960s and had consulted with the elder radical when he was studying at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. From the outset of their relationship, James was terribly impressed by the young man's theoretical abilities and political dedication. Rodney and James were very much in the same tradition, sharing in common a radically democratic, anti-Stalinist, and cross-ethnic conception of socialism. Rodney had returned to Guyana in 1974. The WPA was formed the following year and became a leading opponent of the, quote, cooperative socialist and later Marxist-Leninist government of Prime Minister Forbes Lyndon Burnham and the People's National Congress. Wikipedia says Forbes Burnham lived from 1923 to 1985 and was a Guyanese politician and the leader of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana from 1964 until his death in 1985. Forbes Burnham served as Premier of British Guyana from 1964 to 1966, Prime Minister of Guyana from 1964 to 1980, and then as the first executive president of Guyana, second president overall from 1980 to 1985. He is often regarded as a strong man who embraced his own version of socialism. Educated as a lawyer, Forbes Burnham was instrumental in the foundation of two political parties, the People's National Congress and the People's Progressive Party, and would come to dominate the politics of Guyana. During his time as head of government, Guyana moved from being a British colony to being a republic with no constitutional ties to the United Kingdom. Forbes Burnham's premiership was characterized by the nationalization of foreign-owned private industries, membership of the non-aligned movement, and authoritarian domestic policy. Despite being widely regarded as having a significant role in the political, social, and economic development of Guyana, Forbes Burnham's presidency was marred by accusations of Afrocentrism, state-sanctioned violence, corruption, and electoral fraud. Back to the text. Burnham's regime had become steadily more repressive in the 1970s, turning to political violence to achieve its ends. According to one political scientist, Rodney became a target of this wave of violence because he had, quote, the gift of leadership, end quote. Footnote. Pierre-Michel Fontaine, Walter Rodney, revolutionary and scholar in the Guyanese political cauldron, featured in Edward A. Alpers and Pierre-Michel Fontaine's edited volume, Walter Rodney, Revolutionary and Scholar, a tribute. Let's see if this book has any description of it. Not seeing any. Back to the text and footnote. By the late 1970s, Walter Rodney was sleeping in a different house every night to avoid assassination. Rodney was killed by a car bomb in June 1980. Rodney's death reverberated across the Pan-African world. 3 generations of Caribbean, West African, and North American leftists had come to appreciate Rodney's quiet, forceful style, and there was a great deal of distress concerning the circumstances of his murder, which was never properly investigated. Rodney's passing solicited a moving tribute from James at a meeting organized by Race Today at London's venerable Conway Hall. Quote, we face in the Caribbean over the next 10 or 20 years a tremendous difficulty in developing the country to make the government and the people really recognize what they are, feel what they are, and do the immense work that we can do. And I know no single person in his age more suitable to carry on that work as Walter Rodney would have been, end quote. James. C.L.R. James on Walter Rodney, published in Race Today, November 1980. James made it clear that Rodney would be missed, but in an essay published in 1982, James was quite harsh in his appraisal of Rodney's political work in Guyana. James faulted Rodney and the WPA leadership as a whole for failing to fully comprehend the regime's authoritarian nature and for not being prepared for military-style confrontation. Quote, Rodney recognized that Burnham meant mischief and that he was prepared to use all power, the armed power of the state, to destroy the opposition. Rodney knew that, and he tried to organize against it, and Rodney organized wrong. A key problem in the face of overwhelming state power is how to arm oneself against it. In fact, the arms for a revolution are there. The police and the army have them. What you have to do is to win over a section of the army, and you have arms, and you also take away arms from the government. End quote. James. Footnote. C.L.R. James, Walter Rodney and the Question of Power, published in Walter Rodney, Revolutionary and Scholar. End footnote. James went on to chastise Rodney for staying in Guyana when conditions were so dangerous. James cited the example of Lenin living in exile and working from outside Russia to build a Bolshevik party. Footnote. James, Walter Rodney and the Question of Power. End footnote. Rodney represented the best of the international New Left. To James, it seemed tragically clear that even the best was not good enough. New section. The speeches and articles that James prepared for the subject of Walter Rodney were among James's last public activities. For reasons of health, James withdrew from public speaking in early 1984, quote, although he continued to see many people in his home, end quote. Footnote, see Anna Grimshaw, Jim Murray, and Kent Worcester, C.L.R. James in the 80s, a conversation with Anna Grimshaw, end footnote. Visitors who arrived at the one-room flat on Railton Road in Brixton had various reasons for wanting to meet the legendary author and radical. While a few guests were journalists hoping for interviews, others were young leftists or friends of friends eager for advice about how to take back the political initiative from the newly resurgent right. In the early 1980s, when fears of nuclear war led to a revival of the campaign for nuclear disarmament, many people wanted to talk about the bomb and the tactics appropriate to the age of extremism. Feminist and environmental concerns would also come up in conversations. Some visits were of a more personal nature, involving people who knew James from earlier periods who wanted to find out how James was faring. The Brixton connection was important, the symbolic epicenter of Britain's Afro-Caribbean community. It was also the site of multiracial street protest and anti-government riots in 1981 and 1985. The sense of resonance in contemporary events was enhanced by the fact that Jones's own small apartment was located above the offices of the journal Race Today, which was edited by his comrade and distant relation, Darcus Howe. Wikipedia says Darcus Howe lived from 1943 to 2017 and was a British broadcaster, writer, and racial justice campaigner. Originally from Trinidad, Darcus Howe arrived in England as a teenager in 1961, intending to study law and settling in London. There, Darcus Howe joined the British Black Panthers, a group named in sympathy with the U.S. Black Panther Party. Darcus Howe came to public attention in 1970 as one of the 9 protesters known as the Mangrove Nine, arrested and tried on charges that included conspiracy to incite a riot following a protest against repeated police raids of the Mangrove restaurant in Notting Hill, London. They were all acquitted of the most serious charges, and the trial became the first judicial acknowledgement of behavior, the repeated raids motivated by racial hatred rather than legitimate crime control within the Metropolitan Police. In 1981, Darcus Howe organized a 20,000-strong Black People's Day of Action in protest at the handling of the investigation in the New Cross house fire, in which 13 Black teenagers died. Howe was an editor of Race Today and chairman of the Notting Hill Carnival. He was best known as a television broadcaster in the UK for his Black on Black series on Channel 4, his current affairs program Devil's Advocate, and his work with Tariq Ali on Bandung File. Darcus Howe's television work also included White Tribe 2000, a look at modern Britain and its loss of, quote, Englishness, Slave Nation 2001, Who You Calling Nigger 2004, and Is This My Country 2006, a search for his West Indian identity. Darcus Howe was a columnist for the New Statesman and The Voice. Back to the text. Friends of the journal, such as poet-musician Linton Kwesi Johnson, would regularly look in on him, staying to talk or simply watch television. Linton Kwesi Johnson was born 1952, also known as LKJ, is a Jamaican-born, British-based dub poet and activist. In 2002, he became the second living poet and only Black one to be published in the Penguin Modern Classics series. His performance poetry involves the recitation of his own verse in Jamaican patois, or patois, over dub reggae, usually written in collaboration with reggae producer/artist Dennis Bovell. Back to the text. During this period, James came to rely on the dedicated service and friendship of Anna Grimshaw. The 6 years that she spent as his personal assistant were a tremendous boon to James in what was a lonely and difficult period. Trained as an anthropologist at Cambridge University, Grimshaw appreciated not only his radical politics, but his distinctive outlook. Is a little biography of Anna Grimshaw from Emory College of Arts and Sciences, Department of Anthropology. It says Anna Grimshaw was trained as an anthropologist at the University of Cambridge. Grimshaw carried out her doctoral research with communities of Buddhist nuns in the Himalayas. For almost a decade, she worked as a public scholar outside the academy. Most notably, Anna Grimshaw served as assistant and editor to the Caribbean writer and historian C.L.R. James. Following James's death in 1989, Grimshaw returned to academic anthropology. Visual anthropology is now a primary field of inquiry. Professor Anna Grimshaw's research interests focus around ethnographic cinema. In particular, Anna Grimshaw is concerned with the ways in which an intellectually challenging anthropology may be pursued by means of visual techniques and technologies. Grimshaw is also committed to practice-based experimental ethnography. This has involved an exploration of new forms and sites for ethnographic work. For example, documentary gallery installation, the photographic essay harnessed to the articulation of a critical perspective towards the conventions of academic anthropology. Anna Grimshaw was one of the founders and editors of the innovative Prickly Pear pamphlet series. In more recent years, Grimshaw has developed a series of collaborations with visual artists, including Material Woman, a video project pursued with British artist Elspeth Owen. See elspethowen.net. The aim here has been to investigate art and anthropology as analogous practices of, quote, making do, working with found materials. Anna Grimshaw's books include Servants of the Buddha, published in 1992, a remembered ethnography about her fieldwork with Buddhist nuns in Ladakh, and The Ethnographer's Eye, Ways of Seeing in Modern Anthropology, published in 2001, which charts the shifting relationship between vision and knowledge in 20th century anthropology. Grimshaw's Observational Cinema, Anthropology, Film, and the Exploration of Social Life, co-authored with Amanda Ravitz, was published in 2009. In 2005, also with Amanda Ravitz, she edited Visualizing Anthropology, Experiments in Image-Based Practice. She is well known for her many publications associated with CLR James, and edited and introduced A Majestic Innings, Writing on Cricket, 2006. The CLR James Reader, published in 1992. Special Delivery, Letters from CLR James to Constance Webb, 1938 to 1947. And CLR James's American Civilization, 1993, with Keith Hart. In 2013, Anna Grimshaw completed a series of films, Dr. Copperwalt, A Life in the Maine Woods. The 4 films, Spring in Dickinson's Reach, A Summer Task, Autumn's Work, and Winter Days, explore the, quote, handmade life, end quote, of Bill Copperwaite, a meditation on time and process. Mr. Copperwaite offers an intimate portrait of a remarkable life, one shaped by nature, work, poetry, and the rhythm of changing seasons. The films are distributed by Berkeley Media. More recently, Anna has completed a new film, A Low Tide, a study of calm digging practices in eastern Maine. Selected 2016 screenings include the American Anthropological Association meetings, Minneapolis, the Greek Ethnographic Film Festival, Athens, Days of Ethnographic Film, Moscow, and the Macedonian International Festival of Ethnological Film, Kotovo. The film trailer is available, blah, 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 at some link. Anna teaches courses in ethnographic cinema, visual culture, experimental ethnography, and ethnographic filmmaking. Back to the text. The 6 years that Anna Grimshaw spent as his personal assistant were a tremendous boon to James in what was a lonely and difficult period. Trained as an anthropologist at Cambridge University, Anna Grimshaw appreciated not only his radical politics, but his distinctive outlook. At the same time, Anna Grimshaw may not have fully shared his infatuation with popular culture. It is for this reason that Anna Grimshaw's recollection about the role of television in his final years is particularly acute. Quote, the television was always on in James's room, but he didn't always watch it. He was very interested in watching old films because he was fascinated by how actors moved around. He watched a film as he watched a cricket match, and was less interested in the story than the particular characters people created on screen. James was also interested in soap operas, and watched American, Australian, and British soap operas. James had seen the importance of soap operas as a modern art form, that they gave a chance for a new relationship to be constructed between audience and artist, between life and art. But James saw quite clearly that the modern soap opera was a distorted form, that it in fact was not an expression of creative form, but was quite the reverse, ... James would never watch Talking Heads programs. He would say, quote, I'm not listening to intellectuals talk at the end of the 20th century, end quote, and would switch immediately back to some dire soap opera, end quote. Footnote, see Grimshaw, Murray, and Worcester, 2000, CLR James in the 1980s. Another interesting anecdote emerged when I asked Anna and Jim about whether James had a sense of eternity. Jim first noted that when James received invitations from churches to speak, he would reply that, quote, spirituality wasn't of interest to him, end quote. Anna then pointed out that he, quote, wasn't a strict rationalist either. The artist in James was very interested in those areas which artists excavate, end quote. Grimshaw described the time when a, quote, very respectable gentleman from Jamaica showed up in his 50s or older, a very proper, old-fashioned sort of gentleman, and he sat down and told his story to us of how he believed his house had been bewitched. He lived in Cambridge, and he told this tale of his neighbors and how they had bewitched him and his wife. It went on for about an hour. CLR was there nodding, asking questions, taking it as a serious account. The story was resolved successfully as the neighbors moved and the bewitch ceased. Afterwards, James said to me, "What did you think of that?" I said, "It's an interesting story." He said, "Well, I found it absolutely fascinating. These things can happen, you know." End quote, end quote. End footnote. As the 1980s wore on, James gradually slipped into physical infirmity. He told one friend at the beginning of the decade that, quote, "My physical shape is not as good as my physical form. I have trouble with the legs and cannot walk very fast, but my flow of speech is as strong as ever, as I demonstrated on radio and television interviews to the astonishment of the surrounding population," end quote. Footnote. Letter from CLR James to Lord Fenner Brockway, 22nd of July, 1980. Unmarked document housed at the archives of the Oil Workers Trade Union, end footnote. It was natural that James would rely more and more on visitors and the media for a sense of what was going on in the world. Grimshaw reports that his, quote, reading declined from about the mid-1980s. He had less and less energy or concentration, ... end quote. James slept quite a lot, but while his productivity dwindled, he never actually retired in any meaningful sense. James kept up with world affairs and tried to stay informed about the opinions and habits of virtually everyone who strayed into his sitting room. In the first half of the decade, he reviewed books and cricket matches for Race Today, wrote about women's writers and politics in Eastern Europe, and sent off disputatious letters to English newspapers on such topics as Lenin's commitment to democracy and politics in the 1930s. James also listened to classical music through a boombox, just as, quote, in the 20s in Trinidad he had a turntable. He wanted to hear music, and that was the form in which it came to him, end quote. James. Setting aside his work on Walter Rodney, James's last articles were marked by their forward-looking and frankly optimistic character. In one of his most widely circulated pieces, he honored the poetry and fiction of Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, and Ntoke Shang for their confidence, insight, and authority. These three authors, James believed, were especially important because they were writing about black women in America, a group that had previously, quote, been held in the background, end quote, and was now being placed, quote, right in front of American literature, end quote. Footnote, CLR James, three black women writers, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, and Ntoke Shang. End footnote. This had the effect not only of transforming contemporary American literature, but of challenging established conceptions of black and women's politics. Quote, "So it seems," James noted, quote, "that in the women's movement, as usual in the United States, black people took part, and they have taken a part in it which, ... is important not only to blacks, but to society as a whole," end quote. James's essay ended with a reminder to all authors to, quote, "write what you think, and maybe what you write about your day-to-day, everyday, commonplace, ordinary life will be some of the same problems that the people of the world are fighting out. You must be able to write what you have to say and know that that is what matters, ... end quote. While this was no doubt the kind of advice he offered in person when Walker, Shanga, Maya Angelou, and Amiri Baraka, and other writers who came to see him in the 1980s. James was equally impressed by the emergence of Poland's Solidarność movement in 1980 to 81, which James saw as comparable in terms of general historical importance to the Hungarian uprising of 1956. Quote, "I don't argue with people anymore about socialism and Marxism," end quote. James boldly told in one interview, quote, "I say, there is solidarity, the working class and the farmers united in making a new society. Now you tell me what else socialism is," end quote. James. CC interviews James on Poland, published in Cultural Correspondence, winter 1983. As James had always insisted, Soviet-style regimes had a tendency to generate enormous levels of mass resistance, which threatened to undermine communism's entire edifice, and in its earlier incarnation at least, Solidarność offered an example of the largely spontaneous form of working-class self-organization that James saw as the precondition for a transition to a socialist society. James was struck by the way in which a global media system advertised Solidarity's genesis and evolution, which served to inspire similar efforts in parts of Eastern Europe and China. At a pro-Solidarność rally held in 1981 in New York City, James spoke not only of events in Europe, but of the possibility of a social movement emerging from below in the United States. The speech once again returned to quintessentially Jamesian themes. Quote, "I've spent 25 years of my life here, and one thing I learned is this is no European country. It has an individuality of its own. I've been watching the political system, especially since Roosevelt came and brought in the New Deal and transferred a lot of power to the executive. There are two big meetings here every 4 years. The Democratic Party meets and the Republican Party meets. These are national mobilizations. They are national mobilizations appealing to everybody. But when the day comes, when people feel that these national mobilizations are not doing what they want them to do, there will not be any longer a national mobilization, but there will be a mobilization of the nation. That is something else," end quote. James, Poland, reprinted in At the Rendezvous of Victory, end footnote. As we know, the mobilization of the nations of Central and Eastern Europe resulted in the creation of post-communist systems that have combined parliamentary institutions with capitalist structural reforms accompanied by rising levels of social inequality. James, I think, would have been troubled but not discouraged by these developments. James would have applauded the demise of communism in Europe and the former Soviet Union and would have expected that many present-day trends could be reversed or diverted. It is certainly absurd to imagine James believing that something called, quote, history had come to an abrupt conclusion in Central and Eastern Europe, in the United States, or indeed anywhere else. As was fitting, James received a variety of awards and tributes in the 1980s. In-depth television interviews were aired in Britain and the West Indies, and Toussaint L'Ouverture was revised and performed on the London stage in 1986 under the title The Black Jacobins. Its author was awarded an honorary Doctor of Letters by the University of the West Indies in 1983, and in 1985 a public library in the Hackney section of London was named in James's honor. Talking History, a 1-hour conversation with the historian E.P. Thompson, filmed in 1981, was shown throughout Britain in 1983 as part of a ceremony sponsored by the Greater London Council for the International Year of Peace. The book Cricket, edited by Anna Grimshaw and published in 1986, collected half a century's worth of writings. Having received glowing reviews in the British press, Cricket went on to become one of Allison and Busby's biggest sellers. The earliest article featured 1932's The Greatest of All Bowlers, an impressionist sketch of S.F. Barnes, had first appeared in the Manchester Guardian. The article Decline of English Cricket, taken from 1985's Race Today review, is not only a great title, but is one of the very last articles James ever wrote. With the heft and panache of a book designed for a coffee table, Grimshaw's Cricket shows off some of the author's best prose. It also reminds us that over the years, James published articles solely pertaining to cricket in an exotic array of outlets, all the way from specialist journals, Cricket Quarterly, The Cricketer, to newspapers, Glasgow Herald, Manchester Guardian, Port of Spain Gazette, to political journals, The Keys, The Nation, Race Today, and edited books. Allison and Busby could also take credit for publishing 3 volumes of selected writings. The Future and the Present, published in 1977, Spheres of Existence, 1980, and At the Rendezvous of History, 1984. All 3 titles helped bring James's name to the attention of a new generation of readers. This is particularly true of Britain, where quality dailies and labor movement publications garnished the series with rave reviews. As several reviewers noted, the volumes recovered a number of pieces that had long since gone out of print. These include Triumph, The Revolutionary Answer to the Negro Problem in the USA, Dialectical Materialism and the Fate of Humanity, and Every Cook Can Govern. The series also featured carefully selected extracts from several books, such as World's Revolution, Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, and Facing Reality. The series' major weakness is that the individual volumes lack thematic coherence. For several months in 1980, James stayed in San Fernando as an honored guest of George Weeks and the oil-field Workers' Trade Union. It was his last stretch as a public figure in the West Indies. In the winter of 1981, the OWTU awarded James the Labor Star, the union's highest award, at their 43rd annual conference. As Consuelo Lopez writes, darkest Howe led James to the front of the hall, where, quote, hundreds of union delegates rose to applaud their defiant warrior. Easing his frail limbs into a chair, James watched his audience settle down to hear his speech on the, quote, seizure of power. Quote, when the time comes for you to seize the power, end quote. James reminded his audience, quote, you won't need anyone to tell you, you will take it, end quote, end quote. James's relationship with the Union was rooted in a common political bond and on a recognition of mutual needs. James's need for a West Indian political base and the Union's need for untarnished heroes. While James's fiery rhetoric may have incited the passions of the Union's cadre, in many circles these sentiments only helped cement his status as a political pariah. The establishment's open disdain for was the source of some irritation for James, who left Trinidad shortly after receiving the Labour Star to return to London. When an interviewer from Trinidad's Sunday Express showed up at his flat in London in 1982, James caustically noted that, quote, my name is mud in Trinidad. I get more recognition and understanding in the USA, in Canada, and in this country than I get in Trinidad, end quote. James. Asked by another interviewer in 1986 if he felt homesick for the West Indies, he flatly stated, quote, no, I don't miss it. He went on to explain, quote, the people are always telling me that the climate is not as good here, but the climate is outside. I am in here in the warm, ... In any case, my education, the books I was brought up on, the sports were all British. I feel at home here, end quote. James. But James often reminded visitors that his favorite meal was bacalao, stewed saltfish and white rice, a West Indian dish. Several years after his last visit, James was awarded the Trinity Cross, Trinidad and Tobago's highest national honor, at a ceremony in London attended by the Prime Minister of Trinidad, A.N.R. Robinson. His comrade in arms, George Weeks, received the Trinity Cross in the same year, 1988, having only recently been demonized. Both were on their way to becoming mythologized by a government that ironically was more market-oriented than its predecessor, the PNM. For James, at least, this level of recognition was becoming familiar in Britain. A few years before the Trinity Cross ceremony, for example, the New Society's David Widgery told that magazine's readers in an aside, quote, to the best of my ability, I have attempted not to hero worship this man who, if Marxists believed in such things, would be the greatest living Marxist, and failed, end quote. Widgery. A meeting with C.L.R. James, published in Bull's edited volume, C.L.R. James' Life and Work. In the same period, the London Times referred to the elder radical as a, quote, Black Plato, with the paper's correspondent writing that it, quote, is not necessary to be persuaded by all James' prophecies and Marxist jargon to recognize a sage and a good man, end quote. Footnote. Philip Howard, C.L.R. James on the Necessity to Attack, published in London Times, July 2nd, 1980. In the same year, James told a reporter from another newspaper that he would like to finally settle in, quote, my liking place, Florence, end quote. End footnote. With his withdrawal from everyday activity, some observers may have sensed that James was no longer dangerous or controversial, a safe Marxist. But James continued to offer a potent symbol of erudition and revolutionary determination. James's portrait on the cover of the third volume of Selected Writings, At the Rendezvous of Victory, taken by Lord Snowdon, captured an austere gentleman sitting on a stiff brown chair, tightly clutching an old-fashioned brim hat. Wikipedia says, Anthony Charles Robert Armstrong Jones, 1st Earl of Snowdon, lived from 1930 to 2017. He was a British photographer. Snowdon is best known internationally for his portraits of world notables many of them published in Vogue, Vanity Fair, the Sunday Times Magazine, the Sunday Telegraph Magazine, and other venues. More than 280 of his photographs are in the permanent collections of the National Portrait Gallery. From 1968 through 1973, he also made several television documentary films. Snowden was also a relentless and successful campaigner for disabled people, achieving dozens of groundbreaking political, economic, structural, transportation, and educational reforms for persons with disabilities during his adult life. From 1960 to 1978, Lord Snowden was married to Princess Margaret, the sister of Queen Elizabeth II. Back to the text. It is an arresting portrait, complex, stately, resolute, but slightly haunted, melancholic. Yet despite the evidence of the photograph, he remained committed to the politics of radical transformation and was hopeful about the future. Thus, while it would be easy, it would also be a profound mistake to find the setbacks of the 1970s and 1980s registered in his deep brown eyes. The essential truth is that he never for a single moment appeared to become discouraged or irresolute in any way. He found particular solace in the fact that younger generations of activists were discovering and making use of his books and ideas, and he remained the personification of optimism. C.L.R. James died of a chest infection on the 31st of May, 1989, after a short illness. James lived to the ripe old age. I'm used to saying ripe old age. James had lived to the ripe age of 88. James's body was returned to Trinidad and was buried in a cemetery near Tunapuna. Respectable obituaries appeared in major newspapers across the globe. In the New York Times, Selma Weinstein James observed that, quote, C.L.R. James was fundamentally a political person, and his great contribution was to break away from the very narrow and white male concept of what Marxist politics was. James saw the world, literature, sports, politics, and music as one totality, and saw political life as embodying all of those, which was very different from the politics he walked into in the middle of the late 1930s, first in England and then in the United States, end quote. Selma James. James's old friend, the cricket writer John Arlott, writing in the Manchester Guardian, noted that James was, quote, a fluent lecturer and broadcaster, his voice pleasantly modulated, the sentences flowing as smoothly and roundly as if he were reading them from script, instead of spinning them from an untrammeled and ordered mind. Wikipedia says John Arlott lived from 1914 to 1991 and was an English journalist, author, and cricket commentator for the BBC's Test Match special. John Arlott was also a poet and wine connoisseur. From his poetic phraseology, he became a cricket commentator noted for, quote, his wonderful gift for evoking cricketing moments, end quote, by the BBC. Back to the text. Other obituaries referred to his eclectic range of interests, his unswerving fealty to Marxism, and his contributions to the history and the historiography of the Caribbean. In the West Indies, his passing merited banner headlines. A lengthy editorial in the Trinidadian Guardian remarked that it was doubtful whether, quote, any developing country has produced a man of such wide-ranging intellectualism and such fervent action, a writer, philosopher, revolutionary whose life in the final analysis will remain a celebration of the capacity of the human mind and intellect, end quote. The economist Lloyd Best, who had been close to C.L.R. James from the late 1950s onward, told a reporter that he, quote, will always remain the dean above us and the master. It is impossible to imagine even an approximation to a replacement, end quote. Lloyd Best. Wikipedia says Lloyd Best was a Trinidadian intellectual, columnist, professor, and economist who lived from 1934 to 2007. Back to the text. The Prime Minister, A.N.R. Robinson, called James, quote, one of our most outstanding literary figures, end quote, while opposition leader Patrick Manning said the Caribbean owed, quote, an inestimable debt to James for his pivotal role in establishing a literary and intellectual tradition in this part of the world, end quote. Manning's statement effectively signaled that the PNM's hostility to its old comrade and adversary had come to an end. Hereafter, James would be regarded as part of the West Indian pantheon. Despite the revisionist consensus over James's eminence, there was a small controversy over whether his body would receive a state funeral when it was finally returned to the West Indies. James had left 3 instructions regarding his final arrangements: that he be buried in Trinidad, that the oil field workers would be responsible for whatever ceremonies took place, and that any memorial be strictly secular in character. The 3rd instruction was particularly provocative in that the concept of a secular burial is virtually unheard of in Trinidad. Yet it was the 2nd condition that generated the most political heat, and it was only after a great deal of wrangling that the government dropped its plans for a state funeral and agreed that the arrangements would rest in the hands of Week's successor, Errol MacLeod, and the OWTU. The Union held a ceremony of return at the National Airport on Monday, June 12, 1989, and a celebration of life at the Union's Palm Club. The latter, attended by over 1,000 people, featured tributes by George Lamming, Martin Glaberman, Darcus Howe, and the OWTU's David Abdullah, and several others, as well as calypso music by 2 of its best-known practitioners, David Rudder and the Mighty Sparrow. At different junctures, steel drum orchestras played Stravinsky's Rite of Spring and the International. A smaller crowd formed a burial procession at Tunapuna Cemetery. Later that same day, under heavy rain, James was buried with his Trinity Cross. New section. I visited North Trace and Tunapuna in early December 1992, just prior to completing an earlier draft of this manuscript. North Trace is a tiny hamlet nestled in an agricultural breadbasket. The village, which consisted of a few streets converging on a main road, cannot be found on any of the maps sold in Port of Spain. At one intersection there is a 1960s-style schoolhouse for primary-age students. It is sited next to the visible remains of a far older schoolhouse where Robert James once worked as a principal. It is not a wealthy area. In neighboring villages, I saw barefoot children carry water in buckets from community wells to individual homes. The visit to North Trace reinforced my sense that James was accustomed to travel and migration, to making friends in a new context, and seeing how people lived in different places at a very early age. Tunapuna is a far larger town, lying on the heavily urbanized northwest corridor between Arima and Port of Spain. It is a bustling, industrious community, more crowded than it was in 1901, but in certain respects recognizable from James's description in Beyond a Boundary. The playing fields he once described looking out on seem to have been partially paved over, with the remainder turned into a playground, and his childhood home on Ward Street is now a forlorn edifice overgrown with weeds and vine. Certainly there are features of the town's landscape that would have been familiar to the boy training for his exhibition. Vegetable markets, narrow lanes, and houses set on concrete blocks, birdsong, stray dogs, and the lush green hills of the northern range that lend an impressive backdrop to the activities below. Only the urban sprawl, the steady drone of the traffic, the stores selling videotapes and other new commodities would have seemed strange or unfamiliar. And even these things could have been anticipated, for it had long been a place where commercial interests thrived, where goods were sold and traded, and where the world's inventions soon found their way. The town cemetery abuts the main road where the railway once ran. It is an English-style graveyard, containing a slightly haphazard mixture of family plots, outdoor bric-a-brac, and solitary gravestones. A section of the area is marked Hindu, implying that the rest is for Christians. Among the bramble and markers are a variety of animal and some hidden and some tethered. A variety of animals, some hidden and some tethered. Dogs, heron, gophers, bees, butterflies, and cattle were all visible on a hot day at the end of the rainy season. Ida Elizabeth Jones is buried near the entrance to the graveyard. Her weathered tombstone lists her as having lived from 1876 to 1944. Her eldest son is buried toward the back of the site, and the gravestone, fashioned in the shape of an open book, is curiously impressive. One of the book's open pages carries a simple inscription, Cyril Heinel Robert James T.C., Trinity Cost, 1901 to 1984, a man of letters. The other page contains an apt quote from Beyond a Boundary, quote, "Times would pass, old empires would fall and new ones take their place. The relations of countries and the relations of classes had to change. Before I discovered that it is not the quality of goods and utility which matter, but movement, not where you are or what you have, but where you have come from, where you are going, and the rate at which you are getting there." End quote. It is a good and decent resting place, a suitable place as any, I suppose, to mark the passage of time. That's the end of this chapter and the end of the book. Thank you so much for listening.